Hello and welcome to Sleep Tales. Find a comfortable position. Let your body feel heavy and relaxed. Let go of the day. Tonight, we have a story to help you find deep and peaceful rest. It is a story about time, about purpose, and about the quiet beauty of a life well lived. So close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let our story begin. Our story is called The Mapmaker of the Scairn Isles. Arthur Pendleton existed in a room that smelled of time. It was a scent made of many things. It was the dry, sweet smell of old paper. It was the sharp, dark smell of black ink. It was the faint, clean smell of wood polish used on his desk for 50 years. These smells were the air he breathed. They were more real to him than the air of the busy city outside his window. From his third-floor room, he could hear the city's constant noise, the rumble of cars, the distant cry of sirens, the hurried sounds of people who were always going somewhere important. But in his room, the only sound was the gentle tick of a large wooden clock on the wall. It was a slow, steady sound. A sound that measured a different kind of time. Arthur was a man of 68 years. His hair was thin and white. He wore small, round glasses that sat on his nose. His hands were his most notable feature. The fingers were long and slender, but the skin was not smooth. It was a map of his life's work. There were faint, dark stains of ink deep in the lines of his skin. There were small, pale scars from the slip of a sharp penknife. His hands were the hands of a cartographer, a maker of maps. He had worked in this same room, for the same company, since he was a young man. He had learned the craft from an old man named Mr. Gable, who had learned it from his own father. It was a craft of patience and precision. It was a craft of paper and ink and tools made of brass and wood. Arthur loved his tools. They were his companions. They lay on his large wooden desk in perfect order. There was a heavy brass compass, its point still sharp and true. There were wooden rulers with faded numbers. There were special pens with fine metal tips for drawing the thinnest of lines. There were small glass bottles of ink, black and blue and red, each with a tight cork stopper. He knew the weight and feel of each tool. He knew the sound the pen made as it moved across the thick, textured paper. This was his world, and he knew his world was ending. The company had changed. Young men in sharp suits now walked the halls. They talked in a language Arthur did not understand. They used words like synergy and workflow and digital integration. They carried thin, bright screens and tapped on them with their fingers. They did not smell of ink and paper. They smelled of sharp, new cologne and coffee. The old ways were seen as slow and inefficient. The craft he had dedicated his life to was now just a relic, a piece of history, like him. One Tuesday afternoon, the door to his office opened. It was a young man named Mr. Harris. He was the new director. He was always smiling, but his eyes never smiled. He did not seem to belong in the old, dusty room. His suit was too clean, his shoes too shiny. He held a thin electronic tablet in his hand. He looked around the room at the shelves of rolled maps, at the dark wood, at Arthur's desk. He looked at it all as if it were a museum. Arthur felt like an exhibit. The young man cleared his throat. He spoke about the future of the company. He said they were moving into a new era of mapping, an era of satellites and data points and interactive displays. It was all very exciting, he said. He did not look at Arthur as he spoke. He looked at his tablet. Then he finally looked at Arthur. He said Arthur's position was no longer required. The company was grateful for his many years of service. A generous retirement package had been prepared. The words were polite. They were meant to sound kind, but to Arthur, they felt like stones. Each word was a heavy weight on his heart. He had known this day was coming. He had felt it for years. But the reality of it was a cold, sharp pain. His life's work, his identity, it was all being erased with a few polite words from a young man who had never held a real pen. But there was one more thing, Mr. Harris said. One final project. He called it a gesture of respect for Arthur's long service. He swiped his finger on his tablet and showed Arthur a picture of a remote place, a small cluster of islands in the deep blue sea. The Scairn Isles, he said. The company's official map of the Isles was over 70 years old. It was a legal requirement to have it updated. Since all their resources were focused on the new digital platform, they needed someone with the old skills to do it. It was a simple survey job. Just confirm the existing landmarks, make a few notes, and draw a new master copy. It would take a month, maybe two, a quiet way to finish his time. Arthur looked at the image of the islands. They were sending him away to a forgotten place, to do a forgotten job, until his time was officially over. He felt a deep, profound sadness settle over him. He had nowhere else to go. This office was his home. This work was his life. He looked at the young man and nodded slowly. He said he would do it. That evening, after Mr. Harris had left, Arthur sat alone in his silent office. The city lights began to turn on outside, but he did not turn on his lamp. He sat in the growing darkness. The ticking of the clock was the only sound. It sounded like a countdown. He slowly began to pack. Not his clothes, not yet. He began to pack his tools. This was a ritual he could not rush. He took a long, shallow wooden box from a shelf. It was lined with soft, dark velvet. One by one, he cleaned and polished each tool before placing it in its custom-cut space. He wiped the heavy brass compass until it shone in the dim light. He felt its familiar weight in his palm. He ran his thumb over the smooth, worn wood of his favorite ruler. He checked the tips of his pens, ensuring they were clean and sharp. He carefully sealed his ink bottles, tapping the corks in tight. These were not just objects. They were extensions of his hands, of his mind. They were his partners in the quiet art of making sense of the world, of putting it onto paper. As he packed them away, it felt like he was saying goodbye. He was a mapmaker with no more maps to make. He was a man with one last empty journey to take, a journey to a place he did not know, to mark the end of everything he had ever been. He closed the lid of the box. The sound echoed in the quiet room. It sounded like a door closing on his life. Chapter 1: The Crossing and the Silence. The journey to the Scairn Isles was a lesson in slowness. It was a journey of peeling away the layers of the world he knew. First, there was the train. Arthur sat by a large window, his wooden box of tools on the seat beside him. The train pulled out of the grand, noisy city station, a place of echoing announcements and hurried footsteps. For the first hour, the view was a blur of brick walls, rooftops, and the back gardens of endless houses. The city clung to the train, unwilling to let go. But slowly, the buildings grew smaller and farther apart. The gray of the city was replaced by the green of the countryside. He watched fields roll by, dotted with sheep that looked like small, white stones. He saw clusters of trees, their leaves rustling in a wind he could not feel. He saw small towns with quiet streets and a church steeple. The rhythm of the train was steady and constant. A clatter of wheels on the track, a gentle rocking motion. It was a rhythm that encouraged thought. Arthur thought about his life. He saw it not as a grand adventure, but as a single, straight line drawn on a map. A line from his childhood home to his apprenticeship, to his 50 years in the same office. It was a neat, orderly line, but it felt so small. Now, that line had run off the edge of the paper. He was traveling into the blank space beyond. He felt a sense of unreality, as if he were a character in a book he had not written. The train journey lasted all day. As evening fell, the train arrived at a small coastal town. This was the end of the line. The air that greeted him when he stepped onto the platform was different. It was heavy with the smell of salt and dampness. The noise of the city was gone. He could hear the cry of seagulls and the distant sound of a foghorn. He spent the night in a small guest house. His room was simple and clean. He did not unpack his tools. He sat by the window and looked out at the dark water of the harbor. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky. He felt like a man waiting for something, but he did not know what. The next morning, he walked to the ferry terminal. It was a low wooden building at the end of a long pier. A single large ferry was docked there, its paint peeling from years of sea and salt. It was called the Scairn Queen. There were only a few other passengers, a family with 2 young children, and a few islanders returning home with boxes of supplies from the mainland. They all seemed to know each other. They nodded and spoke in low, quiet voices. Arthur stood by himself, feeling like an intruder. The crossing took 4 hours. As the ferry pulled away from the mainland, the town and the green hills behind it slowly shrank. Soon, they were just a thin line on the horizon. Then, they were gone. There was nothing but water in every direction. The sea was a deep, dark blue. The sky was a vast, empty gray. The ferry engine was a low, steady thrum that vibrated through the soles of his shoes. Arthur stood on the deck, holding on to the cold metal rail. The wind was strong and cold. It pulled at his coat and whipped his thin hair. He tasted salt on his lips. He watched the seabirds as they followed the ferry, soaring on the wind with effortless grace. For a long time, there was nothing to see but the endless movement of the water. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he saw it, a dark shape on the horizon. At first, it was just a smudge, a shadow on the sea. But as the ferry moved closer, the smudge grew larger and took form. It was the Scairn Isles, a cluster of low, rugged islands rising from the water. They looked harsh and unwelcoming. The ferry sailed into a channel between 2 of the larger islands. The water here was calmer. Arthur could see the details of the land now. Steep, rocky cliffs fell directly into the sea. The tops of the islands were covered in a blanket of tough, green and brown vegetation. There were no trees. The islands looked as if they had been worn down by a relentless wind. The main harbor was on the largest island. It was a small, sheltered bay, protected by 2 arms of rock. As the ferry maneuvered toward the stone pier, Arthur saw the village for the first time. It was a small collection of stone houses clustered around the harbor. They were built to withstand the weather, with thick walls and small windows. There was no bright paint, only the natural gray and brown of the local stone. A few small fishing boats were tied up at the pier, bobbing gently on the water. On the pier, a handful of people waited, an old man in a thick sweater, a woman with a basket. No one seemed to be in a hurry. The ferry docked with a gentle bump against the pier. Thick ropes were thrown and secured. A ramp was lowered. Arthur picked up his suitcase and his box of tools. He walked down the ramp and set foot on the Scairn Isles. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It was not an absence of sound, it was a presence. He could hear the water lapping against the stones of the pier. He could hear the wind whistling around the corners of the houses. He could hear the cry of a distant bird, but there were no human sounds of hurry, no cars, no sirens, no shouting. The silence was so deep that it felt like it was pressing in on him. It made the sounds of the city that still echoed in his memory seem loud and violent. He stood for a moment, just breathing in the clean, cold air. It smelled of the sea, of wet rock, and of something wild and green that he did not have a name for. The few people on the pier looked at him with quiet curiosity. They did not stare, but he felt their eyes on him. He was a stranger, a new face in a place where new faces were rare. He felt the need to explain himself, but he did not know what to say. He simply nodded to an old man who gave a slow, deliberate nod in return. He had been given instructions to find his cottage. It was a short walk from the harbor. He followed a single paved road that wound its way up from the pier. The road was narrow, just wide enough for one small vehicle. The stone houses he passed seemed to have grown out of the ground. Their gardens were small and practical, with patches of hardy vegetables and low, tough flowers. He saw no one. Doors were closed. Windows were like dark, watching eyes. He found the cottage at the end of the village where the paved road turned into a dirt track. It was small and solitary, set a little apart from the others. It was made of the same dark gray stone. The roof was made of thick, heavy slates. A low stone wall enclosed a small patch of overgrown grass. There was a key in a small lockbox by the door. He opened it and stepped inside. The air in the cottage was cold and smelled of dust and disuse. It was a simple place. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, a sagging armchair, and a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs. A small kitchen area was in one corner, with a sink and a few empty cupboards. A door led to a small bedroom with a narrow bed and a wooden wardrobe. Another door led to a tiny, cold bathroom. The furniture was old and worn, but solid. The floors were bare wood. The only decoration on the walls was a faded painting of a ship at sea. It was a sparse, lonely place, but it was clean. Arthur put his suitcase on the bed. He carried his precious box of tools to the wooden table in the main room. This was the most important thing. He needed to create his workspace. He needed to create a small island of order in this strange new place. He opened the box. The velvet lining seemed very dark in the gray light coming through the small window. He took out a soft cloth and wiped the surface of the table, clearing it of a fine layer of dust. Then he began the ritual of unpacking his tools. He did it with the same slow care he had used when packing them. He placed his large drawing board on one end of the table. He laid a fresh, clean sheet of thick, cream-colored paper on it, securing the corners with metal clips. The clean white space of the paper looked stark and promising. He then arranged his tools beside it. Next to it, he laid out his rulers from longest to shortest. He stood the small glass bottles of ink in a neat row. He uncorked the bottle of black ink. The sharp, familiar smell filled the small space around the table. It was a comfort to him. It was the smell of his life, of his purpose. He took out his favorite pen, the one with the smooth wooden handle that fit perfectly in his hand. He dipped the metal tip into the ink. He held the pen over the paper for a moment. This was his space. This was his work. Even if the work felt meaningless, the process was something he could hold on to. He put the pen down. He was not ready to make a mark yet. He spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking his clothes and putting them away in the wardrobe. He put a few books he had brought on a small shelf by the fireplace. He tried to make the cold little cottage feel a little more like a home, but it resisted. It felt like a place for waiting, not for living. His first days on the island followed a simple, repetitive pattern. Each morning, he would wake up early. He would make a simple breakfast of toast and tea. Then, he would take his map and a small notebook and go out to work. His task was to map the official landmarks, the ones listed on the old charts from 70 years ago. The first day, he mapped the harbor. He set up a small tripod and used his compass to take precise bearings. He measured the length of the pier. He sketched the outline of the harbor buildings. The work was methodical. It required concentration, but it felt hollow. The islanders who worked on their boats or mended their nets in the harbor watched him with a detached interest. They did not speak to him. He was a man with strange equipment, doing a strange official job. They left him alone. He would return to the cottage in the late afternoon, his hands cold and his spirit low. He would transfer his measurements and sketches onto the large, clean map on his table. He drew neat black lines. He wrote clear block letters, harbor, P-I-E-R, fish shed. The map was accurate. It was perfect. And it was completely empty of life. The second day, he mapped the village itself. It was not a large task. There was the single paved road. There was the post office, which was also the only store. There was the small community hall. He walked the length of the road and back again, taking measurements, noting the position of each building. He saw a few people, a woman sweeping her doorstep, 2 men talking by the wall of the store. They would nod as he passed. A simple, non-committal nod. He nodded back. There was no conversation. The silence of the island was not just an absence of noise. It was an absence of connection. He felt more alone than he had ever felt in his crowded, noisy city. That evening, he added the road and the buildings to his map. The map was slowly filling up with lines and labels, but it told no story. It was a diagram of an empty place. On the third day, he decided to walk to the lighthouse. It was marked on the old map as being on the far northern tip of the island. The paved road ended at his cottage, so he had to follow a rough track that cut across the open land. The walk was long. The wind was constant, a powerful force that pushed against him. The land was a rolling expanse of tough grass and low purple-flowered heather. There were sheep everywhere, grazing peacefully. They would lift their heads and watch him pass with uninterested, yellow eyes. The land was beautiful in a stark, rugged way, but it also felt empty and immense. He felt very small walking through it. After an hour, he saw the lighthouse. It was a tall white tower standing on the edge of a high cliff. It looked proud and lonely against the gray sky. He walked all the way to its base. The wind was fierce here, roaring in his ears. He stood at the edge of the cliff and looked down. The sea crashed against the black rocks far below, sending up bursts of white spray. The power of the water was immense, terrifying. He felt a sense of vertigo. He stepped back. He did his work. He took his bearings. He noted the position of the lighthouse on his map. This was an important landmark, a light for sailors in the dark. But it was also automated. There was no keeper. It was just a machine, doing its job in total isolation. As he stood there, with the wind shouting around him, he felt a deep kinship with the lonely tower. He felt like a relic, a machine performing a final, pointless task in a vast, empty world. He turned and began the long, slow walk back to his cottage, the sound of the wind following him all the way. Chapter 2: An Unmarked Path. The days that followed his trip to the lighthouse fell into a quiet, unchanging rhythm, a rhythm of emptiness. Each morning, the gray light would filter through the small window of his cottage, and Arthur would wake to the profound silence of the island. He would lie in his narrow bed for a few moments listening. He would listen for a sound that was not the wind or the distant sea. A car horn, a neighbor's door closing, the familiar rumble of a city waking up. But those sounds never came. There was only the wind, a constant sighing presence that moved around the stone walls of the cottage. He would get up and perform his small morning rituals. He would boil water on the small electric stove. He would make a cup of tea, strong and dark. He would toast a piece of bread and cover it with a thin layer of butter. He ate at the wooden table, facing the clean white expanse of his growing map. The map was his work. It was his purpose for being here, but looking at it brought him no joy. It was a skeleton, a collection of bones without any flesh. He spent the next week completing the official survey. He walked to every point that was marked on the old, yellowed chart from 70 years ago. One day, he went to find a landmark called the Old Mill. The map showed it near a small stream in a shallow valley. He found the stream easily enough, a narrow ribbon of brown water moving slowly through the marshy ground. But of the mill, there was almost nothing left. There was a low, crumbling stone wall, half buried in the earth and covered in thick green moss. There were a few large flat stones that might have been the foundation. That was all. Nature had reclaimed it almost completely. He stood there for a long time, looking at the pile of stones. He thought about the people who had built it, the hands that had cut and placed these stones, the miller who had worked here, grinding grain for the islanders. All of that life, all of that effort, was now just a footnote on a map and a pile of rubble. He took out his notebook. He made his measurements. He confirmed the location. The old mill was still here, technically. He walked back to his cottage, the wind pushing at his back. That evening, he added a small symbol to his map. He wrote the words Old Mill Ruin in his neat, precise letters. The map was more complete. He felt more empty. His interactions with the islanders remained brief and distant. He went to the post office and store every few days to buy bread, milk, and cheese. The woman behind the counter was polite but quiet. She would take his money and give him his change with a small nod. He would say thank you. She would nod again. That was the extent of their conversation. He saw other people in the store, men in thick sweaters buying tobacco, women buying vegetables. They would stop their quiet conversations when he entered. They would watch him as he gathered his few items. He felt their eyes on his back. It was not a hostile gaze. It was a gaze of simple, unshakable curiosity. He was an object that did not belong, a strange bird that had landed on their shore for a season. He did not know how to bridge the gap between their world and his. He did not know the words to say, so he said nothing. He would take his supplies and walk back to his lonely cottage, the silence of the island wrapping around him once more. The evenings were the longest. After a simple meal, he would sit at his table and work on the map. The work itself was a comfort, the familiar feel of the pen in his hand, the steady pressure needed to draw a clean line, the deep black of the ink against the cream-colored paper. He took pride in his craftsmanship. The lines were perfect. The lettering was flawless. But as the map grew more detailed, his sense of its failure grew stronger. He had a perfect map of the island's body, but he knew nothing of its heart. He knew the location of the harbor, but he did not know the stories of the boats that sailed from it. He knew the shape of the village, but he did not know the lives lived inside the stone houses. He knew the position of the lighthouse, but he did not know the names of the keepers who had trimmed its lamp through dark and stormy nights. His map was a perfect lie. It was a map of a place that did not truly exist. It showed a surface and ignored the soul. One morning, about 2 weeks into his stay, something shifted inside him. He woke up, made his tea, and sat down at the table. He looked at his map. He was supposed to spend the day mapping a section of the southern coastline, an area marked with a few rock formations. He looked at the neat, empty lines of his work, and he felt a sudden, deep wave of resistance. He could not do it. He could not spend another day walking to a place. He could not spend another evening adding another meaningless label to his sterile creation. The thought of it filled him with a weariness that went deeper than his bones. He stood up from the table. He put on his coat and his sturdy walking boots, but he did not pick up his tripod. He did not pack his measuring tools or his compass. He left the official map lying on the table. He took only a small, empty notebook and a single pencil, and he put them in his coat pocket. He did not know why. It was just a feeling. Today, he would not work. He would just walk. He would walk without a destination. He would walk until his legs were tired. He would walk just to see what was there. He left the cottage and walked through the silent village. He did not turn towards the southern coast, where his work was supposed to take him. Instead, he walked down to the harbor and then turned west, following a path that hugged the edge of the land. The path was rougher here. It was not a road, just a track worn into the earth by generations of feet. The sea was on his left, a vast expanse of gray-blue water under a gray-white sky. The roar of the waves was a constant companion. It was a powerful, rhythmic sound, like the breathing of a giant creature. He walked for a long time. The path rose and fell with the contours of the land. Sometimes he was high on a cliff, looking down at the churning water crashing against black rocks. Other times, the path would dip down to a small, stony beach, where the waves hissed as they rolled over millions of smooth, gray pebbles. He walked without thinking, letting the rhythm of his footsteps and the sound of the sea empty his mind. He was not a cartographer. He was not a man with a job to do. He was just a man walking. He felt the world around him with a new clarity. He noticed things he had not noticed before when he was focused on his work. He saw the colors of the lichen on the rocks, bright patches of orange and yellow and pale green. They were like small, beautiful maps of their own. He saw the way the tough, wiry grass grew in clumps, its blades bent permanently in one direction by the constant wind. He watched the seabirds as they rode the currents of air along the cliffs. Their wings held steady as they soared and dipped with impossible grace. He felt the salt spray on his face, cold and damp. He felt the solidness of the earth beneath his feet. He was a part of this landscape, not just an observer of it. For the first time since arriving, he did not feel entirely alone. He felt a connection to the rocks, the water, the wind. They were ancient and enduring. They did not care about his sadness or his sense of failure. They simply were, and in their presence, his own troubles began to feel smaller, less important. After walking for more than an hour, he came to a place where the coastline was particularly rugged. A high, sheer cliff of dark rock dropped straight into the sea. The path he was on turned inland, skirting the edge of the dangerous cliff. He followed it. The land here was wild and overgrown. The grass was taller, nearly up to his waist in some places. The air was thick with the earthy smell of damp soil and vegetation. He was about to continue following the main track when he saw it. It was not obvious. It was something he could have easily missed. A faint, subtle parting in the tall grass to his left. It was not a proper path. It was more like a suggestion of a path. A slight depression in the ground. A place where the grass was a little more trodden down than the surrounding wilderness. It led away from the main track, towards the overgrown heath. It was not on any of his maps. His logical mind, the mind of the meticulous mapmaker, told him to ignore it. It was nothing. A sheep track, perhaps. It probably led nowhere. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for a very long time, was curious. It was the part of him that had first fallen in love with maps as a boy. The part that loved the idea of discovery, of finding what was hidden. Where did this faint trail go? Who had made it? Why was it here? He stood for a long moment, hesitating. The main track was safe and known. This faint trail was a mystery. He looked back the way he had come. He could see the gray roofs of the village in the far distance. He could go back to his cottage, to his empty map, or he could step off the known path. He took a deep breath of the cool, clean air, and then, slowly, deliberately, he turned and stepped into the tall grass, following the unmarked trail. The path was narrow and winding. It felt different from the official roads and tracks he had walked before. This path was not a straight line from one point to another. It seemed to have a life of its own. It twisted and turned, following the gentle rises and falls of the land. The tall grass brushed against his legs as he walked. The sound of the sea began to fade behind him. It was replaced by a new sound, the sound of the wind moving through the grass. It was a soft, whispering sound, like a secret being told. He walked deeper into the heath. The ground beneath his feet was soft and springy with moss. Small, tough purple flowers grew everywhere, a splash of color in the green and brown landscape. He felt as if he had stepped into a different world. A world that was hidden just behind the one he knew. He had no idea where he was going. He was completely lost, according to his own maps. But for the first time, he did not feel lost. He felt like he was being led. He walked for what felt like a long time. The path continued to wind its way through the heath. He could no longer see the village. He could no longer see the sea. He was surrounded on all sides by the tall, swaying grass and the vast, open sky. He felt a sense of peace settle over him. The worries of his job, his retirement, his loneliness, they all seemed to fade away. There was only the path and the sky and the whisper of the wind. Then, just as he was beginning to wonder if the path would go on forever, it began to descend. It led him down a gentle slope, and the sound of the sea began to return. But it was a different sound now. Not the loud roar of the open ocean, but a soft, lapping sound. The path opened up suddenly, and he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He was standing at the edge of a small, perfectly secluded cove. It was a half circle of pale sandy beach, sheltered on three sides by high, grassy cliffs. The cliffs protected it from the wind. Down here, the air was still and calm. The water in the cove was a beautiful, clear turquoise color. Gentle little waves, no bigger than ripples, lapped quietly at the sand. The sun, which had been hidden behind the clouds, broke through, and a beam of light illuminated the cove. It looked like a secret garden. It was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. He walked slowly down onto the sand. The sand was soft and fine. He looked around. There was no sign of modern life. No plastic, no rubbish. Just sand and rock and water. And then he saw it. On the far side of the cove, tucked against the base of the cliff, was a single bench. It was made of stone, not a modern concrete bench, but a bench made of large, flat pieces of the local gray rock, weathered and ancient. It was covered in patches of soft green moss and pale lichen. It was positioned to face directly out to sea, looking over the calm water of the cove towards the open ocean beyond. It was not a piece of public furniture. It was clear that someone had built it a long time ago for a specific purpose. It had a presence. It felt important. Arthur walked over to the bench. He ran his hand over the top of it. The stone was rough and cool beneath his fingers. He felt the texture of the lichen, dry and delicate. He felt a sense of reverence for this simple object. It had sat here for years, through countless storms and sunny days, waiting. He sat down on the bench. The stone was cold at first, but it felt solid and steady beneath him. From here, he had a perfect view of the cove and the sea beyond. The cliffs on either side framed the view like a painting. He could hear the gentle lap of the waves and the distant cry of a seabird. The wind that had been his constant companion on the island could not reach him here. He was in a pocket of profound peace. He sat there for a long time, not thinking, just being. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to release. He felt the tightness in his chest begin to loosen. This place was a sanctuary. He felt a sense of gratitude for the faint, unmarked path that had led him here. He was so lost in the peace of the place that he did not hear her approach. He simply became aware that he was no longer alone. He turned his head, and she was there. A woman was standing a short distance away, near the base of the cliff. She was not young, but not old either. Perhaps his age, or a little younger. She had long gray hair tied back from her face. She wore simple, practical clothes and carried a woven basket. She was quietly gathering something from the plants that grew at the bottom of the cliffs. She looked up and saw him looking at her. She did not seem startled or surprised to see a stranger sitting on the bench. She simply looked at him with calm, clear eyes. She gave him a small, gentle smile. Arthur felt a sudden need to explain himself, to justify his presence in this secret place. He felt like an intruder again. He stood up from the bench. "I am sorry," he said. His voice sounded loud in the quiet cove. "I was just walking. I did not mean to disturb you." The woman shook her head slowly. Her movements were calm and unhurried. "You are not disturbing me," she said. Her voice was soft, with the gentle accent of the islanders. "This place is for everyone." She took a few steps closer. He could see that her basket was filled with green leaves and small white flowers. "It is a good place for walking and for sitting." Arthur looked at the stone bench. "This bench," he said, more to himself than to her. "It is very old." "Yes," she said. "It has been here a very long time." She came and stood beside him, looking out at the sea. "It has a name." Arthur looked at her, curious. "A name?" "We call it the grieving bench," she said, her voice soft and even. The name was a surprise. It was a sad name for such a beautiful, peaceful place. He looked at the bench again, seeing it in a new light. It was not just a place of rest, it was a place of memory. "Why is it called that?" he asked quietly. The woman did not answer immediately. She looked out at the horizon for a long moment, as if gathering her thoughts from the air. Then she began to speak. "A long time ago," she said, "a woman lived on the island. Her husband was a fisherman. He would go out in his boat for days at a time. She would always watch for his return from the cliffs. One autumn, a terrible storm came. It came suddenly, with no warning. His boat was still out at sea. The storm lasted for 2 days. When it was over, his boat did not return. The other fishermen searched for him. They found pieces of his boat, but they never found him. The sea had taken him." She paused, and Arthur listened to the soft sound of the waves. The story felt real, as if it had happened just yesterday. "The woman," she continued, "his wife, she did not believe he was gone. Every day she would come here, to this cove. She would sit and watch the sea, waiting for his boat to appear on the horizon. The other islanders told her to stop, to accept her loss, but she could not. So her brothers came here, and with their own hands they built this bench for her from the stones of the cliff. They built it so she would have a proper place to sit and wait. She came here every single day, in the sun and in the rain, until she was a very old woman. She never stopped waiting. Arthur looked at the weathered stone bench. He could almost see the woman sitting there, a small, determined figure, her eyes fixed on the empty sea. The bench was not just stone. It was made of love and hope, and a sadness so deep it had soaked into the very rock, and she is the one who still waits. Arthur asked, remembering the woman's words from when she first greeted him, about the woman who still waited in spirit. He knew the answer. The woman he now knew as Lena nodded. Some people say that on quiet evenings, if you sit here long enough, you can still feel her presence. Not as a ghost, but as a feeling of loyalty, of a love that does not end. This was the first story. It was the first piece of the island's true map that had been given to him. He looked from the bench to the calm water of the cove, to the vast ocean beyond. He looked at the quiet woman, Lena, standing beside him. He understood with a sudden, powerful clarity that his work up until this point had been meaningless. The lines and labels on his official map were empty words. The real map of the Scaran Isles was not made of ink and paper. It was made of stories like this one. It was a map of the human heart. And he, Arthur Pendleton, the mapmaker, had just found the very first mark on a map he did not even know he was supposed to be making. A new kind of work lay before him, a work of listening, a work of understanding. He felt the weight of that first story settle inside him. It was not a heavy weight. It was a weight that gave him substance. It was the beginning of a purpose he had thought he had lost forever. Chapter 3: The Island's Memory. The walk back from the hidden cove was different. The world had been changed for Arthur, not by a storm or a shift in the earth, but by a story. He followed the faint, unmarked path back through the tall grass. The path no longer felt like a random trail. It felt like a secret entrance, a doorway he had been allowed to pass through. The whispering sound of the wind in the grass no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like it was carrying other stories, other secrets that he could not yet understand. He reached the main track along the cliffs and turned back towards the village. The sea was still there, vast and gray, but it was not just a body of water anymore. It was a keeper of secrets. It held the fisherman who had never returned. It held the memory of the woman who had waited on the stone bench. The whole landscape seemed to be alive with a history he had been blind to. The rocks were not just rocks, they were witnesses. The wind was not just wind, it was a voice. He walked with a new purpose in his step. The weariness he had felt in his bones for weeks seemed to have lifted. He felt a quiet energy, a sense of direction that had nothing to do with a compass or a map. He passed the stony beaches and the high cliffs, and he saw them all with new eyes. He wondered what stories they held, what had happened on this stretch of shore, who had stood on that high point of rock and looked out at the horizon. The island was no longer a simple shape of land to be measured and recorded. It was a book, and he had just been shown the first page. He could not wait to read the rest. When he reached his small, cold cottage, it too felt different. He opened the door and stepped inside. The air was still and cool. His official map was still spread out on the table, a landscape of neat black lines and empty white spaces. He stood over it and looked down. He saw the harbor, the village, the lighthouse, the ruin of the old mill. He saw the coastline he had so carefully drawn, and he felt a deep and profound sense of pity for the map. It was so confident, so precise, and so completely wrong. It was a blind man's description of a beautiful painting. It captured the frame, but missed the art entirely. The grieving bench was not on this map. The story of the waiting woman was not in these lines. The map was a lie, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was incomplete. It lacked a heart. He made a simple dinner of bread and cheese. It was in the sheltered cove, sitting on the moss-covered stone bench. He thought of Lena, the woman who had shared the story with him. He remembered the calmness in her eyes, the gentle way she spoke. She had not told him a piece of trivia. She had given him a gift, a piece of the island's soul. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep within him, that he could not continue with his official task. He could not add another deadline to his empty map. His work, the work he had been sent here to do, was over. But a new work, a true work, was just beginning. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay in the narrow bed, the rough wool of the blanket pulled up to his chin. He listened to the wind moving around the corners of the cottage. It was a lonely sound, but he was not lonely. He was kept company by the story of the waiting woman. He saw her in his mind's eye, a determined figure sitting on the stone bench, her gaze fixed on the endless sea. He felt the cold of the stone, the dampness of the sea spray on her face. He felt the immense weight of her hope, a hope that lasted a lifetime. He wondered about her name. He wondered about the color of her husband's boat. He wondered what it felt like to love someone so much that you would spend the rest of your life waiting for them. The story was a small warm light in the darkness of the room. It was a story of great sadness, but also of great love, and it had changed everything for him. He finally understood that a place is not made of rock and soil. A place is made of the memories of the people who have lived there. The next morning, he woke with a clear and simple plan. He had to find Lena. He had to ask her if there were other stories, other places like the grieving bench. He dressed quickly, his hands moving with a purpose he had not felt in years. He did not look at the official map on his table. He knew it had nothing to teach him. He left the cottage and walked towards the village. The morning was bright and cool. The air was clean and sharp in his lungs. He walked down the narrow road, past the silent stone houses, but today they did not feel like they were watching him. They felt like they were waiting for him. He felt like he had a reason to be here, a question that needed an answer. He walked to the post office, the building that also served as the island's only store. He had been here several times before, for his small purchases, his brief and silent transactions. Today, he was not here for bread or milk. He was here for a story. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. A small bell above the door jingled, a cheerful, surprising sound in the quiet village. The store was a small, dense space, packed with all the things an island community might need. The air was a mix of smells, the clean, soapy smell of washing powder, the earthy smell of potatoes in a wooden crate, the faint, salty smell of dried fish, and the sweet smell of biscuits in a tin. Shelves reached from the floor to the ceiling, filled with cans and jars, balls of thick wool for knitting, coils of rope, and waterproof boots. It was a place of practical, necessary things. Lena was behind the wooden counter. She was arranging a small stack of letters. She looked up when the bell jingled, and a small smile touched her lips when she saw it was him. It was the same calm, gentle smile she had given him in the cove. Arthur felt a wave of nervousness. He did not know how to ask what he wanted to ask. He was a man of lines and measurements, not a man of feelings and stories. He walked to the counter. He felt clumsy and out of place. "Good morning," Lena said. Her voice was as calm as he remembered. "Good morning," Arthur replied. He cleared his throat. "I am not here to buy anything today." Lena simply waited, her hands resting on the counter. She did not rush him. She looked at him with her clear, patient eyes. "Yesterday," he began, his voice a little unsteady. "The place you showed me, the grieving bench." He paused, searching for the right words. "I have not stopped thinking about it." About the story, he looked at her directly. "I was wondering," he said, his voice dropping a little lower. "Are there other places on the island that have stories like that?" Lena's expression did not change, but he felt a subtle shift in the air between them. Her gaze became more focused, more searching. A hint of caution entered her eyes. She was no longer just a shopkeeper. She was a guardian. "There are many such places," she said slowly. "The island is very old. It holds many memories." She paused, "But they are not landmarks. They are not tourist attractions. You will not find them on any map." Her words were not an accusation, but Arthur felt the truth of them like a sharp stone. "I know," he said quickly. "My map, it is useless." The words came out before he had even thought them. He found himself unrolling the large sheet of paper on the smooth, worn surface of the wooden counter. The map took up most of the space. It looked impressive and official. He pointed to the neat lines, the precise labels. "This is the map I was sent here to make," he said. "It is accurate. Every measurement is correct, but you are right. It is empty. It says nothing about this place. It does not show the grieving bench. It does not show the woman who waited. It is just paper and ink. It has no heart." He looked up from the map and met her gaze. His own eyes were filled with a genuine, humble sadness. "I do not want to make a map like this anymore," he said quietly. "I want to understand." Lena looked at him for a long, silent moment. She looked at his earnest face, at his ink-stained fingers resting on the edge of the soulless map. She saw the truth in his eyes. She saw that he was not a man trying to take something from the island. He was a man trying to give something back, even if he did not know what it was yet. The caution in her eyes softened. She gave him a small, slow nod. "There is someone you should talk to," she said. "His name is Tomas. He has lived on this island his whole life. His memory is long, longer than most." She came out from behind the counter. "Finish your work here," she said, nodding to the map. "I will take you to him." Arthur carefully rolled up his official map. As he did, he felt like he was rolling up his old life, his old way of seeing the world. He tucked the roll under his arm. It felt heavy and useless. He followed Lena out of the store, back into the bright, clear air. She did not lead him down the main road. Instead, she turned down a narrow, unpaved lane between two stone cottages. The lane was just wide enough for one person to walk. It was a path he had never noticed before. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The lane opened up into a small cluster of houses that were older and closer together than the ones on the main road. They were tucked into a small dip in the land, sheltered from the worst of the wind. Lena stopped in front of a small, low cottage with a dark blue door. A thin trail of wood smoke rose from its stone chimney, a pale gray ribbon against the blue sky. The small garden in front was not neat, but it was full of life. It was a tangle of fishing nets being mended, a stack of lobster pots, and a few hardy plants growing in old wooden barrels. The whole place smelled of smoke and salt and the sea. Lena knocked on the blue door. After a moment, the door opened. A man stood there. He was old, perhaps older than Arthur. His face was a map of its own. It was deeply wrinkled, the lines carved by decades of sun and wind and sea spray. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of the sea on a winter's day, but they were bright and alert. His hands, which rested on the doorframe, were large and gnarled, the hands of a man who had worked hard his entire life. This was Tomas. Lena spoke to him in the soft island dialect, a version of the language that was quicker and more musical than what Arthur had heard before. She spoke for a minute, her hands making small, descriptive gestures. She gestured towards Arthur, and then she made a motion like drawing a map in the air. Tomas looked at Arthur. He studied him with his pale blue eyes. It was a long, steady gaze. Arthur did not feel judged. He felt seen. After a long moment, Tomas nodded slowly and opened the door wider, a silent invitation to enter. Arthur stepped into the cottage. The inside was one small, warm room. A fire glowed in a large stone fireplace, filling the room with warmth and the gentle smell of burning peat. The room was full of the objects of a long life. On the mantelpiece, there was a model of a fishing boat, its sails perfectly rigged. On the walls, there were old, faded photographs of people and boats. A low table was covered in the tools for mending nets, sharp knives and smooth wooden needles. An old armchair by the fire was worn smooth with use. The whole cottage felt like a hug. It was the complete opposite of his own sparse, rented cottage.
This was a home.
Tomas gestured for them to sit at a small wooden table. Lena went to the small kitchen area and began to make tea, moving with a quiet familiarity. Tomas sat down opposite Arthur. They sat in silence for a few minutes. It was not an awkward silence. It was a comfortable, waiting silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the clink of Lena putting 3 mugs on the table. She brought over a teapot and poured the dark, fragrant tea. She placed a mug in front of each of them. The warmth of the mug seeped into Arthur's cold hands. He held it with both hands, grateful for its heat. After taking a slow sip of his tea, Tomas finally spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in the tide. "Lena tells me you are making a map," he said, looking at Arthur over the rim of his mug. "I am," Arthur said, "but I have been making the wrong kind of map." Tomas nodded slowly, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "There are 2 islands," he said. "There is the island of rock and grass. That is the one you can measure. Then there is the island of memory. That one has no edges. You cannot measure it. You can only listen to it." Arthur leaned forward, his whole body focused on the old fisherman. "I would like to listen," he said. Tomas took another sip of his tea. He looked into the fire, his pale eyes distant, looking at something far away in the past. "There is a place," he began. "It is not a famous place. It has no name on any chart. It is a cliff on the eastern side of the island. Not the highest cliff, not the most dangerous. Just a cliff." He paused. "When I was a boy, my brother and I, we would go there. Our father was a fisherman, like his father before him. His boat was called the Seabird. We knew the shape of it. We could spot it from miles away. When he was due back from the sea, my brother and I would run to that cliff. We would sit there for hours, our legs dangling over the edge. We would watch the horizon. The sea can be empty for a very long time. And then a small speck appears, and your heart jumps. We would watch the speck grow. We would argue about whether it was his boat or another, but we always knew. We knew the way it sat in the water. We would watch it get bigger and bigger until we could see the color of the sail, and then, finally, we could see him, a small figure at the helm. We would not leave until we saw him wave. Then we would run home as fast as we could to tell our mother he was safe. Tomas fell silent. He was looking at the fire, but he was seeing a small boat on a distant horizon. Arthur could see it too. He could see two small boys sitting on a cliff, their eyes straining to see across the water. He could feel their hope, their anxiety, their final bursting joy. "My brother is gone now," Tomas said, his voice soft. "And my father, the sea took him many years ago. The seabird is gone, but the cliff is still there. For me, that cliff will always be Father's watch. It is a place where I can still see them, the two small boys, the man in the boat." A deep silence filled the small, warm room. The story hung in the air, a beautiful, sad, and powerful thing. It was a story about a simple cliff, but it was also a story about love and family and loss, and the way memory makes a place sacred. Arthur felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had been given another gift, another piece of the true map. "Father's watch," he said, tasting the name. It was a perfect name. He spent another hour in the warm cottage, listening. Tomas told other stories, small memories of his life on the island. Lena sat with them, drinking her tea, sometimes adding a small detail to a story, a name or a date. Arthur did not write anything down. He did not want to interrupt the flow of memory with the scratch of a pencil. He just listened. He absorbed the stories. He let them settle inside him. When it was time to go, he stood up and thanked Tomas. The old man simply nodded, a deep understanding in his pale blue eyes. Lena walked with him back to the main road. "He has many stories. You only have to be quiet enough to hear them." Arthur walked back to his cottage alone. His mind was full. He was carrying the two stories, the grieving bench and Father's watch. They felt precious, like rare jewels. He entered his cottage. The official map was still rolled up on the table. He picked it up, went to a corner of the room, and stood it upright, like a pillar of a forgotten temple. He would not unroll it again. He then went to his wooden box of supplies. He took out a new sheet of paper. It was the same kind of expensive, thick, cream-colored paper he used for his official work. But this sheet felt different. It was not for a job. It was for something else. He laid it on the drawing board. It was a vast, clean, empty space, a space of possibility. He took out his favorite pen and dipped it in the black ink. He looked at the empty sheet. Where to begin? He began with what he knew. He began to draw the coastline of the island. He drew it from memory, but it was a new kind of memory. He drew the curve of the sheltered cove. He drew the sharp edge of the eastern cliffs. His lines were still precise, but they were not cold. They were drawn with a new feeling, a feeling of reverence. When he had a rough outline of the island, he stopped. He looked at the shape he had drawn, and then he made his first mark. He did not use a symbol from his cartographer's key. He made a small, simple dot on the edge of the secret cove. Next to it, in his smallest, neatest handwriting, he wrote, "The grieving bench for the woman who waited." Then he moved his pen to the eastern side of the island. He found the place Tomas had described. He made another small dot on the edge of a cliff. Beside it, he wrote, "Father's watch, for the two boys and the seabird." He put his pen down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at his new map. It was almost entirely empty. There were just two small dots and two small sentences. But to Arthur, this vast, empty sheet of paper was already more full, more true, and more beautiful than the completed official map that stood rolled up in the corner. He was not just a map maker anymore. He was becoming a keeper of memories, and his real work had just begun. Chapter 4: The Memory Trails. The days that followed Arthur's visit to Tomas the fisherman took on a new shape. The shape was not defined by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the slow and patient gathering of stories. His life was no longer empty. It was full of a quiet and profound purpose. He had found his true work, or rather, the work had found him. His morning routine was now a ritual of anticipation. He would wake, and the first thing he would see was not the gray light in the window, but the large, cream-colored sheet of paper on his drawing table, his new map. He would get out of bed and walk to it, still in his sleeping clothes. He would look at the 2 small marks he had made, the grieving bench, Father's watch. They were like 2 small seeds planted in a vast, empty field. He felt a deep and patient desire to see the field grow, to fill it with life. He would make his tea and toast and eat at the table, his eyes on the map. He would think about the stories. He would see the waiting woman. He would see the 2 small boys on the cliff. The stories were alive inside him. They were more real than the news in the papers he no longer read. They were the truth of this place. After his simple breakfast, he would prepare for the day's walk. He put on his sturdy boots, now scuffed and worn from the island paths. He put on his warm coat, and in his pocket, he placed his small, soft-covered notebook and his pencil. These were his most important tools now, not the brass compass, not the precise rulers, just a book for listening and a pencil for remembering. He did not walk every day with Lena. Sometimes a few days would pass where he would walk alone, but these walks were different now. He was not just passing through a landscape. He was searching. He was listening. He would walk along a path and wonder, what happened here? Who walked this way before me? He would stop and look at an old, gnarled tree or a strange formation of rocks, and he would feel a sense of question. He was learning to read the land, not for its measurements, but for its feelings. He learned to recognize the paths that were made not for getting somewhere quickly, but for simply being somewhere special. These paths were softer, more winding. They were the veins of the island, carrying its lifeblood of memory. The islanders in the village began to treat him differently. His quiet presence was becoming familiar. They saw him walking every day in all weather. They saw him not with his strange equipment, but with his simple notebook. They saw the mud on his boots. They saw the change in his eyes. He was no longer a curious outsider. He was becoming a part of the landscape himself. His morning nod to them was now returned with a small, genuine smile. They had seen his useless official map in the store. They had heard from Lena and Tomas that he was trying to understand, and in this small, quiet community, that effort meant everything. One morning, as he was buying a loaf of bread from Lena, she looked at him with her calm, knowing eyes. "There's a place I think you should see today," she said. "An old wall. Alistair can tell you about it. He is working in his field today. You will find him." She gave him simple directions. It was a part of the island he had not yet explored. A low, wide valley in the center of the island, a place more sheltered from the wind. Arthur felt that familiar spark of anticipation. He thanked her, took his bread, and set out. The walk was different from his coastal journeys. He followed a track that led away from the sea. The roar of the waves was replaced by a gentle quiet. The wind was softer here, a murmur instead of a shout. The land was greener, the grass was richer. He could see that this was a place for farming. The air smelled of damp earth and growing things. He walked for nearly an hour, following the gentle downward slope of the land. He saw a few small stone farmhouses nestled into the landscape, smoke rising from their chimneys. He saw fields marked by low stone walls, with sheep grazing peacefully inside them. It was a landscape of quiet, patient work. He followed Lena's directions until he saw a figure in a distant field. It was a man, bent over, working the soil with a spade. The man worked with a slow, steady rhythm, turning the dark earth over, one spadeful at a time. Arthur walked towards him, feeling like he was approaching a place of deep importance. He stopped at the edge of the field, not wanting to interrupt the man's work. The man must have sensed his presence, because he stopped. He pushed his spade into the earth and straightened up slowly, his hand on his back. He was an old man, his face weathered like an old piece of wood. He wore a thick hand-knitted sweater and a worn cap. He looked at Arthur with eyes that were clear and direct. "Alistair?" Arthur asked. The old man nodded. My name is Arthur. Lena sent me. She said you could tell me about an old wall." Alistair looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Arthur's muddy boots and his simple coat. Then he looked down at Arthur's hands. He saw they were empty, except for the small notebook Arthur held. He gave a slow nod. He said again. "The wall, come." He pulled his spade from the earth and began to walk, and Arthur followed him. They walked to the far edge of the field, and there Arthur saw it. It was a long, low stone wall, but it was unlike the other walls that divided the fields. This wall was almost completely swallowed by the earth. It was a long moss-covered ridge, a spine of rock half buried in the soil. In some places, only the very top of the stones were visible. In other places, the wall rose to his waist. It was covered in a thick green blanket of moss that felt damp and soft to the touch. Small, delicate ferns grew in the cracks between the stones. It was clear that this wall was immensely old. It had not been built. It was slowly returning to the earth from which it came. It ran in a long, straight line, disappearing into the fields on either side. "This is it," Alistair said, his voice quiet. He ran his hand over the top of the mossy stones. It was a familiar, gentle gesture. "We call it the sunken fence." "It's a boundary wall?" Arthur asked. "It was," Alistair said. "A long time ago. This whole valley was 5 small farms. Not just mine, 5 families. We lived here. The farm on the other side of this wall belonged to the MacLeods, and beyond them, the Robertsons. We all had our own land, our own walls, but we were not separate. If a storm brought a roof down, all the men would be there the next day to fix it. If a lamb was born sick, my wife would be there with her remedies. This wall, it marked the edge of my land. But it was also where I would meet John MacLeod at the end of the day. We would stand here and talk. We would talk about the weather, the sheep, our children. It was not just a wall. It was a meeting place." Alistair paused. He looked out over the green valley. His eyes were seeing something that was no longer there. He was seeing the other farms. He was seeing the smoke from their chimneys. He was hearing the voices of his neighbors. "The children grew up," he said, his voice softer now. "They saw the world on the television. They did not want a life of hard work and cold winters. They wanted the city. They wanted wages and warm houses." One by one, the families left. The MacLeods were the first to go. Then the Robertsons. Their children did not want the farms. The houses stood empty for a while. Then the roofs fell in, the walls crumbled, the fields went wild. He looked down at the sunken fence. "I bought their land, all of it. I had to. The land needs to be worked, but it is too much for one man. I just keep my own fields now. The rest is just for the sheep." He sighed, a deep, slow sound. "Now this is the only thing that is left of their farm. This wall, it is sinking back into the ground, just like the memory of them. In another lifetime, it will be gone completely, and no one will know that a whole life was lived on the other side of this fence. Arthur stood in silence. He felt the immense weight of the story. It was not the story of one man. It was the story of a whole way of life that had faded away. This was not a memory of a single event, but a memory of a slow, quiet disappearance. He looked at the mossy stones. He could feel the presence of the lost farms. He could feel the ghosts of the families who had lived and worked and loved on this land. The sunken fence was a tombstone for a community. He took out his small notebook. His hands were a little unsteady. He sketched the wall. He drew the way the moss grew over it, the way the ferns sprouted from its cracks. He tried to capture the way it seemed to be sighing, sinking back into the earth. He looked at Alistair. "Thank you," he said. The words felt small and inadequate. Alistair just nodded. He picked up a loose stone from the top of the wall and carefully placed it back into a gap. A small, simple act of preservation, a refusal to let the memory disappear completely. Arthur walked back to his cottage with the story of the sunken fence heavy in his heart. It was a sad story, but it was also a story of deep connection to the land. He felt a profound respect for Alistair, the old farmer who was the last keeper of the valley's memory. That evening, he sat at his drawing table. He took his pen and found the green valley in the center of his map. He drew a long, wavering line, a line that looked like it was half buried in the paper. Next to it, he wrote, "The sunken fence, where the lost farms are remembered." He looked at the words. They were simple, but they held the weight of Alistair's story. His map was growing. It was becoming a chronicle of what had been lost. A few days later, Lena suggested another place. "It is different from the others," she said. "It is a place for children and for quiet thoughts." This time, the journey was not into a valley, but up into the low, rounded hills that formed the spine of the island. The path was steeper, and the wind was stronger again. The higher he climbed, the more the world opened up around him. He could see the whole island spread out below him, a patchwork of green and brown, surrounded by the endless blue of the sea. Lena walked with him this time. They walked in a comfortable silence, their footsteps the only sound on the narrow path. The air up here felt thin and clean. After a long climb, Lena led him off the main path. They walked over a soft, springy ground of heather and moss. She led him to a place that was hidden from view until they were almost upon it. It was a small, tight circle of trees. The trees were not tall, but they were ancient. They were rowan trees, their trunks twisted and gnarled by centuries of wind. Their branches grew in strange interlocking shapes, forming a dense canopy overhead. Stepping inside the circle of trees was like stepping into a green, sun-dappled room. The wind, which had been so loud on the hillside, was suddenly muffled. Inside the grove, there was a deep, gentle quiet. The only sound was a soft, rustling murmur as the wind moved through the leaves high above them. Light filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the mossy ground. It was a magical place. It felt sacred. "This is the Whispering Grove," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper itself, as if not wanting to disturb the peace of the place. "It is beautiful," Arthur said, looking up at the ceiling of leaves. "The children love this place," Lena said. She sat down on a large moss-covered stone in the center of the grove. "They believe the trees whisper secrets. If you have a secret that is too heavy to carry, you can come here and tell it to the trees. They will keep it for you. If you are sad, you can sit here, and the trees will whisper comforting things that only you can hear." She smiled a soft, gentle smile. "It is an old belief. My grandmother told it to me. and her grandmother told it to her. We all played here as children. It was our castle, our ship, our secret hiding place. This story was different. It was not a story of a single person or a great sadness. It was a story of a shared belief, a piece of island magic passed down through generations. It was about the way a place could hold the wonder and innocence of childhood. It was not a memory of something that had happened once. It was a memory of something that was always happening. As long as there were children on the island, the grove would be a place of secrets and whispers. Arthur sat down on a stone opposite Lena. He closed his eyes and listened. He heard the gentle, continuous shushing sound of the leaves. It did sound like whispering. He could easily imagine being a child and believing that the trees were talking to him. He felt a sense of peace wash over him. This place was not about loss. It was about continuity. It was about the simple, enduring power of imagination. He did not feel the need to sketch this place. A drawing could not capture the feeling of the light or the sound of the leaves. He just sat and listened and absorbed the quiet magic of the grove. When they left the grove and stepped back out onto the open hillside, the sound of the wind returned, and the world felt loud again. Arthur felt as if he was leaving a church. He carried the quiet of the grove with him all the way back to his cottage. That evening, when he went to his map, he faced a new challenge. How do you draw a whisper? How do you map a feeling? He decided not to use a solid line. He took his pen and drew a small, soft circle of tiny dots in the hills of the island. It was a shape that was barely there, a suggestion of a place rather than a definite location. And beside it, he wrote, "The Whispering Grove, where the trees keep the secrets of children." His mapping was changing. It was becoming more like poetry than science. His next journey came a week later. He felt a growing sense of confidence on the island. He would walk through the village and people would call out a greeting to him. "Good day for a walk, Arthur," they would say. He had learned the names of a few of the fishermen. He had spoken to the woman who delivered the post. He was no longer a stranger. He was Arthur, the man who listened to stories. One afternoon, he was walking on a stretch of coastline he had not visited before. He saw an elderly woman sitting on a large, flat rock, looking out at the sea. She had a kind, wrinkled face and was wrapped in a thick woolen shawl. He nodded to her as he passed. "It is a fine view from here," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It is," Arthur agreed, stopping. "But not the best beach," she said, a twinkle in her eye. "Too many rocks." She pointed further down the coast. "If you want to see the best beach, you must go down there. It is a steep path, but it is worth it." Arthur was intrigued. "What is special about that beach?" he asked. "It is where we learn to be brave," she said simply. The words echoed in his mind. He thanked the woman and continued his walk, his curiosity pulling him forward. He found the path she had spoken of. It was indeed steep, a narrow track that zigzagged down the face of a cliff. He had to watch his footing carefully, but as he descended, he began to see the beach below. It was a perfect crescent of pale, almost white sand. The water in the small bay was calm and clear, a striking shade of turquoise. It was sheltered from the main force of the waves. He finally reached the bottom and stepped onto the sand. It was soft and fine under his boots. The place was breathtakingly beautiful. He walked to the water's edge. He dipped his fingers in. The water was shockingly, bitingly cold. It was the pure, icy cold of the deep Atlantic. He pulled his hand back quickly. "Cold, is it not?" He turned. The old woman from the cliff top was there. She had followed him down the steep path with an agility that surprised him. Her name, he learned, was Morag. "It is the first thing you learn," Morag said, a smile on her face. "The cold." She sat down on a piece of driftwood, her movements slow and deliberate. "This is First Swim Beach," she said. "Every child born on this island, when they reach a certain age, they are brought here, usually in the summer when the sun is warm, but the water is never warm." She looked out at the calm, turquoise sea. "I remember my first swim. I was 7 years old. My father brought me. My mother stood on the sand holding a towel. I was so scared I did not want to go in. The other children were splashing and shouting, but I just stood at the edge. The water looked like ice. My father did not force me. He just said, 'The sea is a part of us, Morag. You do not have to fight it. You just have to be brave enough to meet it.' And he walked in, up to his waist. He turned and smiled at me. And I do not know why, but I took a deep breath, and I ran into the water." She paused, lost in the memory. Arthur could see the little girl, her heart pounding, standing at the edge of the freezing water. "The cold was a shock," Morag continued. "It took my breath away. For a moment, I thought my heart would stop. But then I was in my father's arms. He held me and told me I was the bravest girl on the island. And when I came out, wrapped in the warm towel, I felt different. I felt strong. I had faced the cold. I had done it." She looked at Arthur, her eyes bright with the memory. "My mother had her first swim here, and her mother before her. This sand has felt the footsteps of all our ancestors. It is a place of testing, a place where we pass on our courage. When you see a person from this island, you know one thing about them. You know that as a child, they were brave enough to walk into this water." Arthur was deeply moved. This place held a memory that was a ritual, a shared experience that bound the entire community together across generations. It was a memory of courage, a place where fear was faced and overcome. It was the story of the island's strength, its resilience held in a small, beautiful cove with freezing water. He looked at the beach with a new respect. It was not just sand and water. It was an arena. It was a temple. He spent the rest of the afternoon on the beach, talking with Morag. She told him other stories, small memories of her long life. When he finally climbed the steep path back to the clifftop, he felt a warmth inside him that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the warmth of a shared history. That evening, his map grew again. He drew the perfect crescent of the beach. He drew small, wavy lines to show the calm, cold water. He wrote, "First Swim Beach, where they learn to be brave." He stepped back from his drawing table and looked at his work. The map was no longer an empty field. The seeds he had planted had begun to sprout. There were lines and dots and circles, each one holding a story. The sunken fence, the whispering grove, First Swim Beach, Father's Watch, the grieving bench. The map was becoming a living thing. It was a tapestry woven from the threads of memory, loss, wonder, and courage. His hands were stained with ink. His boots were covered in mud. His small notebook was filling up with the words of the islanders. And Arthur Pendleton, the man who had arrived on the Scairn Isles feeling like a relic, a ghost, felt a deep and quiet joy. He was no longer lost. He had found his place. He was the keeper of the island's memory. He was home. Chapter 5. A Letter and a Choice. The rhythm of Arthur's days settled into a deep and quiet harmony. It was a harmony made of walking, listening, and drawing. He would spend his mornings out on the land, following paths both known and unknown. He learned to move at the island's pace, a slow and deliberate speed that allowed him to notice the small things, the way the light changed on the surface of a rock pool, The tiny, resilient flowers that grew in the cracks of stone walls, the sound of a sheep tearing at the tough grass. He would fill his small notebook with sketches and words, not measurements and data. He was not capturing the island's dimensions. He was trying to capture its feelings. His afternoons were spent in his cottage, at the large wooden table. He would take the memories he had gathered and carefully transfer them to his new map. The map was growing into a beautiful and complex thing. It was a tapestry of stories. He used different colors of ink now, a small act of creative freedom he had never allowed himself in his 50 years of professional work. He used a soft brown ink for the places of old memory, like the sunken fence. He used a bright blue for the places connected to the sea, like Father's watch. He used a deep green for the places of nature and magic, like the Whispering Grove. The map was no longer just black lines on a cream background. It was becoming a reflection of the island's soul, full of color and life. He felt a sense of contentment he had not known was possible. The deep, gnawing feeling of being useless, of being a relic, had vanished. His work had meaning. It was a quiet meaning, a meaning that would never be recognized by the busy world he had left behind. But it was a real and solid thing. He could feel it in the weight of the pen in his hand. He could see it in the growing beauty of the map on his table. He was not just making a map. He was building a sanctuary for memories that would otherwise be lost to the wind. The deep sadness that had followed him to the island had been replaced by a quiet, steady joy. It was the joy of a man who had, at the very end of his life, found the work he was always meant to do. This peaceful rhythm was broken one Tuesday morning. The interruption did not come with a loud noise or a sudden event. It came with the quiet arrival of the post. The mail came to the island 3 times a week on the ferry. A woman named Isla, who was Lena's cousin, would collect it from the harbor and deliver it around the village on her old, sturdy bicycle. Arthur had come to enjoy her brief visits. She always had a cheerful word for him, a comment on the weather, or a question about where his walks had taken him that week. He would see her coming down the track to his cottage, and he would open the door and wait for her. On this morning, she had only one thing for him, not a postcard from a curious tourist or a local newspaper. It was a single, crisp, white envelope. Arthur knew what it was before he even took it from her hand. The logo in the top corner was instantly recognizable. It was the new, sharp, modern logo of his old company. It looked stark and alien in the soft light of the island morning. The envelope itself felt wrong in his hand. It was smooth and stiff, not like the soft, worn things of the island. It felt like a piece of another world, a world of deadlines and efficiency and digital integration. "Looks important," Isla said with a smile, but her eyes were kind. She had seen the change in his face. "Just some old business," Arthur said, trying to keep his voice steady. He thanked her, and she cycled away, leaving him alone on his doorstep with the white envelope in his hand. He stood there for a long time, just holding it. He did not want to open it. He felt a coldness spread through his chest, a feeling he had not had for many weeks. The letter was a reminder of the man he used to be, the life he used to live, a life of following orders, of making maps that were accurate but empty. He felt a deep resistance to letting that world back into his peaceful existence. But he knew he could not stand on his doorstep forever. He went inside, closing the door softly behind him. The cottage, which had become his sanctuary, suddenly felt small and fragile. He placed the letter on the table, next to his beautiful, hand-drawn map. The 2 objects looked like they belonged to different universes. The crisp, white, manufactured envelope, and the soft, cream-colored, handmade map. He made himself a cup of tea. He needed the small, comforting ritual. He held the warm mug in his hands, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He sat down at the table and looked at the letter. He knew he was delaying the inevitable. He finally picked it up. He opened it carefully, slitting the top with an old penknife. He pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The paper was as smooth and cold as the envelope. The words were printed in a sharp, black, soulless font. It was a formal letter, signed by Mr. Harris, the young director who had given him this final assignment. The letter was polite, but its politeness was cold and distant. It started by hoping he was well and that the project was proceeding smoothly. It then moved to the main point. It reminded him that his official retirement date was approaching. It stated that the company needed his finished survey of the Scairn Isles as soon as possible. They were finalizing the new digital mapping platform, and his data needed to be integrated. The letter requested that he send his completed work, along with his field notes and measurements, back to the head office at his earliest convenience. The final paragraph thanked him again for his many years of loyal service and wished him a long and happy retirement. Arthur read the letter 3 times. Each time the words seemed to get colder. They were the words of a machine. They spoke of data and integration and processing. They spoke of his life's work as a set of numbers to be fed into a computer. The letter held no understanding of what he had been doing on this island. It held no understanding of him. To them, he was just a tool that had been sent to perform a function. And now, the function was complete, and the tool was to be put away. A deep, familiar sadness washed over him. The sadness of being misunderstood. The sadness of being obsolete. He put the letter down on the table. He felt a heavy weight pressing down on him. The world he had tried to leave behind had found him. It was making its demands. It was telling him that his real work, his map of memories, did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the official survey, the map of lines and labels that they could turn into digital data. For a moment, he felt a wave of despair. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps his new map was just a foolish, sentimental project of an old man. Perhaps it was meaningless to everyone but him. He stood up and walked to the corner of the room where he kept his old work. He picked up the tightly rolled tube of his official map. He carried it back to the table and, with a heavy heart, he unrolled it. It covered a large part of the table, its edges curling up slightly. He looked down at the map he had spent his first few weeks on the island creating. It was, he had to admit, a perfect piece of technical cartography. The lines were sharp and unwavering. The coastline was rendered with flawless accuracy. The labels for the harbor, the lighthouse, and the village were written in his neatest, most professional script. It was a map that would have earned him praise from his old mentor, Mr. Gable. It was a map that followed all the rules. It was a perfect, beautiful, empty shell. He ran his finger over its smooth surface. He traced the road to the lighthouse. He remembered the feeling of that walk, the fierce wind, the sense of lonely kinship with the automated tower. But the map said nothing of that. It just said lighthouse. He traced the symbol for the old mill. He remembered the crumbling, moss-covered stones, the feeling of a life that had vanished back into the earth. The map said nothing of that. It just said old mill ruin. The map was a collection of facts, but it contained no truth. It was a body without a soul. He looked at this map, his final official assignment, and he felt nothing. No pride, no sense of accomplishment, only a deep and profound emptiness. This was the map they wanted. This was the data they needed to integrate. He let the map roll itself back up into a tube. He did not need to look at it anymore. He then turned his full attention to his other map, the map of memories. It lay on the other side of the table, a warm, colorful island in a sea of dark wood. He leaned over it. He did not see lines and labels. He saw stories. His eyes went to the small dot on the edge of the secret cove. He saw the grieving bench, weathered and ancient. He saw the woman waiting for a boat that would never return. He felt the immense weight of her love and her loss. He moved his gaze to the eastern cliffs. He saw fathers watch. He heard the joy in their shouts when they finally saw their father sail. He looked at the long, wavering line in the central valley. He saw the sunken fence. He felt the quiet sadness of Alistair, the last farmer, the keeper of the memory of a lost community. He saw the circle of tiny dots in the hills, the whispering grove. He heard the soft murmur of the leaves, carrying the secrets of generations of children. He saw the perfect crescent of First Swim Beach. He felt the shocking cold of the water and the surge of pride in a child's heart. This map was not empty. It was full. It was overflowing with life, with joy, with sadness, with courage, with magic. It was a map of the island's heart. It was messy. It was emotional. It was not scientific. It would be useless to a computer. A machine could not integrate a story. A machine could not process a feeling. He stood there, looking down at his creation, and he felt a wave of love for it. It was the most important work he had ever done. It was the only work that had ever truly mattered. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, quiet, and absolute certainty. He could not send them this map. He could not allow these precious stories to be turned into data points, to be stripped of their meaning and stored on a server in a distant city. These stories belonged here, on this island, with the people who lived them. And this map, his map, belonged here too. It was his gift to them, his legacy. A feeling of quiet strength settled over him. It was a feeling he had never known before. All his life he had followed the rules. He had done what was asked of an employee, of a cartographer. He had been a good, obedient man. But now, at the end of his life, he felt a new kind of freedom. The freedom to choose his own work, his own purpose. The freedom to say no. He sat down at the table. He pushed the official map to one side. He pulled a clean sheet of writing paper towards him. He took out his favorite pen, the one he used for his new map. He would write his reply to Mr. Harris. He thought for a long time about what to say. He could be angry, he could be defiant. He could write a long letter explaining what he had discovered, what a true map should be. But he knew it would be pointless. They would not understand. They lived in a different world, a world where feelings could not be measured and therefore did not exist. So he chose another path. He would be polite, he would be brief, he would use their language, but for his own purpose. He dipped his pen in the ink. He wrote a short, simple letter. He thanked Mr. Harris for his message. He stated that the survey of the Scairn Isles was proving to be more complex than he had originally anticipated. He explained that he had discovered a number of historical details and unofficial landmarks that required careful and time-consuming verification. He concluded by saying that he would not be able to send the finished work by the requested deadline. He said he would be in touch when the project was completed, to his own professional satisfaction. He signed it simply, Arthur Penn. He read the letter over. The words were calm and professional, but underneath the polite surface, they were a declaration of independence. He was taking control of his work. He was setting his own standards. He was no longer their employee. He was his own man. He folded the letter, placed it in a clean envelope, and addressed it to the head office. He felt a sense of release, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had made his choice, he would finish his true map at his own pace. He would not be rushed. He would do the work the honor it deserved. In the days that followed his decision, Arthur felt a new lightness in his spirit. But he also began to notice a new heaviness in his body. The long walks over the hills and along the cliffs were becoming more difficult. He would find himself short of breath at the top of a rise that he had climbed easily just a month before. A deep weariness would settle into his bones at the end of the day, a tiredness that a full night's sleep could not completely erase, and a small, soft cough had started. At first, it was just a tickle in his throat, a minor annoyance. He blamed it on the damp island air, but the cough did not go away. It became a quiet, persistent companion. It would wake him sometimes in the night, a dry, hollow sound in the silent cottage. He did not feel fear. He was a man of 68 years. He knew his body was an old machine. He knew that parts would begin to wear out. He accepted it with the same quiet grace with which he had accepted the end of his career. It was simply the way of things, but he did feel a sense of urgency, a quiet pressure. He did not know how much time he had left. He looked at his map, at the large empty spaces that were still waiting to be filled with stories. He felt a deep need to complete his work. Not for a company, not for a deadline, but for the island and for himself. One afternoon, he was sitting with Lena in her small warm kitchen behind the store. The kettle was boiling on the stove. Lena was cutting a slice of a rich dark fruitcake she had baked. The air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and tea. Arthur had a bout of coughing, a dry, racking sound that left him breathless for a moment. Lena stopped what she was doing. She looked at him, her eyes full of a quiet, deep concern that held no pity. "That cough has come to stay," she said. It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact. Arthur nodded, catching his breath. "I think so," he said. His voice was a little raspy. "I find I am getting old, Lena." He said the words simply, without sadness or self-pity. He was stating a truth, just as he would state the position of a landmark on a map. Lena put the slice of cake on a plate and brought it to the table. She sat down opposite him. She did not offer him false reassurances. She did not tell him he was still young, or that the cough was nothing. She met his quiet acceptance with her own. "It is the way of things, Arthur," she said, her voice soft. "We arrive on this island and we stay for a time. We walk its paths, we listen to its wind, and when our time is done, the island holds us." She looked at him with a deep, profound kindness. "You have done good work here. You have been listening. The island knows that. It is grateful." Her words were a great comfort to him. She understood. She understood that his work was not about fighting against the end. It was about creating something beautiful and meaningful in the time he had left. He was not afraid of the growing weariness in his body. He was not afraid of the persistent cough. He was not afraid of the end. His only fear was that he would not have enough time to listen to all the stories. He took a bite of the dark, sweet cake. He took a sip of the hot, strong tea. He sat in the warm kitchen with his friend, and he felt a deep and abiding peace. He had made his choice. He had chosen his work, and he would see it through for as long as he had. Chapter 6. The Heart of the Isles. The island had become Arthur's entire world. His small stone cottage was its center, and from it, the paths of memory spread out like the veins on a leaf. His days were a quiet pilgrimage. He would walk, not to measure, but to feel. He would sit, not to rest, but to listen. His new map, the one spread on his wooden table, was growing richer with every passing day. It was a testament to his listening. The paper was no longer a blank space. It was a landscape of shared secrets, a geography of the human heart. The map was his companion, his confidant. He would talk to it in the quiet evenings, his finger tracing the lines he had drawn, reliving the stories they represented. He felt a deep, abiding connection to this work. It was the first time in his life that his hands were creating something that was truly alive. But as his map grew fuller, he felt his own body growing emptier. The weariness was a constant companion now. It was a heavy cloak he wore, even on the brightest of days. The long walks that had once energized him now left him drained, his legs aching with a deep, persistent throb. His breath was becoming a precious commodity. A short climb would leave him gasping, a hand pressed to his chest, waiting for the tightness to subside. His cough was a part of the cottage's soundscape now, as familiar as the cry of the gulls or the sigh of the wind. It was a dry, insistent sound that echoed in the quiet rooms, a constant reminder that his time was a finite thing. He did not fight this feeling. He accepted it. It was a new kind of measurement, a new kind of clock. It did not tick in seconds and minutes, but in breaths and heartbeats. And it told him that his work was urgent. One afternoon, as the sun was casting long, soft shadows across the land, Lena came to his cottage. She did not knock. The door was always open for her. She came in quietly, carrying a small basket with a flask of tea and 2 cups. She found Arthur at his table, his head bent low over the map, his pen moving with slow, careful strokes. He was adding a small detail to the area around First Swim Beach, a cluster of rocks that Morag had told him was a good place for children to find crabs. He was so absorbed in his work that he did not hear her enter. He only looked up when she placed a cup of tea gently beside his hand. He smiled, a tired but genuine smile. The lines on his face were deeper than when he had arrived on the island. His skin was tanned and weathered by the wind and sun. He looked like he belonged here. "Lena," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "You always know when a man needs a cup of tea. It is a skill all island women have," she said, her own smile soft and kind. She sat down in the chair opposite him. She did not look at the map. She looked at him. She saw the new weariness in his eyes. She saw the slight tremble in his hand as he picked up the cup. They drank their tea in a comfortable silence for a few minutes. The only sound was the ticking of Arthur's old clock and the distant murmur of the sea. "The map is becoming beautiful, Arthur," she said at last, her gaze finally falling on his work. "It is full of our lives. It is not finished," he said, a note of worry in his voice. He looked at the empty spaces on the paper, the parts of the island he had not yet walked, the stories he had not yet heard. "I do not know if there will be time to finish it." Lena looked at him, her eyes clear and calm. "There is one more place you must see," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight of importance. "It is not like the others. It is the most important place. It is the place that holds all the others together." Arthur felt a shift in the air. He had been to places of great sadness and great joy. He had been to places of magic and courage. But Lena's tone told him that this next place was something different, something final. "It is a place we do not show to everyone," she continued, her voice very soft. "We only share it with those we trust, with those who have learned to listen." She looked at him with a deep and steady gaze. "We would like to share it with you." Arthur felt a profound sense of honor. It was a gift of trust so great that it made his heart ache. "When?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "If you feel strong enough. It is a long walk, a steep climb." "I will be strong enough," Arthur said. The words were a promise. to her and to himself. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this journey was the most important one he would ever take. He knew it was the key to his map and to everything else. That night, Arthur could not sleep. He lay in his bed, listening to the wind and his own shallow breathing. He was not anxious. He was filled with a quiet, solemn anticipation. He felt like a student on the night before his final exam. An exam he had been preparing for his entire life without even knowing it. He rose before the sun. He washed his face with cold water, the shock of it making him feel alert and alive. He dressed slowly and carefully, choosing his warmest sweater, his sturdiest boots. He did not eat. He felt that this journey was something to be undertaken on an empty stomach, with a clear mind. He stood before his map in the gray pre-dawn light. He looked at all the places he had been: the grieving bench, Father's watch, the sunken fence, the whispering grove, first swim beach. They were all separate points on the paper, separate stories. But he felt they were all connected, leading to this final unknown place. He was about to find the heart that pumped the lifeblood to all these other memories. He took his walking stick, a smooth, sturdy piece of driftwood he had found on the shore. He left his notebook and pencil on the table. He knew instinctively that this next place was not for sketching or for writing. It was for being. Lena was waiting for him as the first pale light of dawn touched the sky. She carried a small canvas bag with a flask of water. She looked at him and gave a small, slow nod. No words were needed. They set off together. They did not take any of the familiar paths. Lena led him on a trail he had never seen before, one that started behind the last house in the village and immediately began to climb. The path was narrow and rocky, a clear sign that it was not used by many. The ascent began at once. In the first few minutes, Arthur felt a surge of strength. His anticipation carried him forward. But soon, the reality of the climb set in. His legs began to feel heavy, like they were made of lead. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. The cool morning air felt thin in his lungs. His cough started a deep, painful spasm that forced him to stop, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Lena stopped with him. She did not say anything. She did not offer a hand. She simply stood a few feet ahead, waiting patiently, her back to him, giving him the dignity of his struggle. She looked out at the growing light, allowing him the time he needed to recover. Arthur was grateful for her silent understanding. He felt a sting of shame at his own weakness, but he pushed it away. This was his body now. This was the reality of his journey. He took a few deep, ragged breaths, and when he could, he nodded, and they continued on. The climb was a slow, arduous process, a series of short walks and long pauses. During the pauses, Arthur would look back as they gained height. The island began to reveal itself in a new way. The village became a small cluster of stone toys. The harbor was a perfect, tiny crescent. He could see the familiar shapes of the coastline, the cliffs and coves where he had walked and listened. The world was expanding below him. They climbed out of the low-lying areas of grass and heather. The landscape became more raw, more elemental. The soil was thinner here, and the rock of the island showed through in great gray slabs. The vegetation was tougher, more resilient. There were only short, wiry grasses and thick cushions of bright green moss clinging to the stones. The wind was stronger up here, a clean, constant presence. It had no sound of whistling around buildings or rustling through leaves. It was the pure, silent pressure of the sky. The sea was a vast, deep blue canvas that stretched to the edge of the world. They were climbing into a world of rock and sky and wind. Arthur focused on the rhythm of his own body, the thud of his walking stick on the rocky path, the pounding of his own heart in his ears, the struggle of his lungs for air. Each step was an effort, an act of will. His mind became very clear and simple. There was no room for complex thought. There was only the step in front of him and the step after that. Lena was a silent, steady presence ahead of him. She moved with an easy, mountain goat grace, but she never got too far ahead. She was his guide, his anchor. He trusted her completely. He knew she would not lead him to a place he could not reach. The final part of the climb was the steepest. The path disappeared completely. They were scrambling over large, weathered boulders, using their hands for balance. Arthur's lungs burned. His legs trembled with exhaustion. He had to stop every few moments. He felt a deep, primal weariness, a desire to simply lie down on the cold rock and sleep. But he looked up. He could see the summit now, just a little way above them. It was a smooth, rounded cap of rock against the vast, empty sky, and he saw Lena standing there, waiting for him. Her silhouette was small and dark against the brightness of the sky. The sight of her gave him a final surge of strength. He pulled himself up over the last boulder. He took a few more stumbling steps on the flat, rocky ground, and then he was there. He had arrived. He stood on the highest point of the Scarron Isles. He was breathing heavily, his whole body trembling with effort. But he barely noticed his own exhaustion. He was overwhelmed by what he saw. The view was immense. It was a complete circle of the world. He could see the entire island laid out below him like a map. His map. He could see the long, curving arm of the coast that led to the lighthouse. He could see the dip in the land that was the green valley of the sunken fence. He could see the dark smudge of the Whispering Grove on a distant hillside. He could see the glitter of the water at First Swim Beach. He could see it all the places, all the stories. They were all visible from this one single point. And beyond the edges of the island, in every direction, was the endless, breathing sea. The sky was a vast, blue dome above him. He felt like he was standing on the roof of the world. The summit itself was a simple, flat expanse of weathered gray rock, and in the center of it was what Lena had brought him here to see. It was not a grand monument. It was not a ruin. It was a low, perfect circle of stones. The stones were not large. They were about the height of a man's knee, and they were the same gray rock as the summit itself. They were weathered and ancient, covered in patches of pale, almost white lichen. They were arranged in a perfect circle, about the size of a small room. There was an opening in the circle, a small gateway that faced east towards the rising sun. The place was simple, it was humble, but it radiated a feeling of immense age and profound peace. It felt like the most important place on earth. Arthur walked slowly towards the stone circle. He felt a sense of reverence, as if he were entering a church. He stepped through the opening and stood in the center of the circle. The wind was a gentle pressure on his face. The silence was absolute. He looked at Lena. She had followed him in and was standing near the edge of the circle. "What is this place?" Arthur asked. His voice was a quiet breath, easily carried away by the wind. "It is the place of seeing," Lena said, her own voice soft and clear. "It is the heart of the island." "The heart," Arthur repeated, understanding the truth of the words. From here, you could feel the pulse of the whole island. "It is not a place for the dead," Lena explained gently. "It is a place for memory. When someone we love is gone, we do not come here to grieve them. We come here to see them. We look out at the places where we knew them. We look at the beach where we swam with them as children. We look at the harbor where we waited for their boat. We look at the path where we walked with them. From here, you can see all the parts of their life. You can hold all the memories of them at once, and you can feel close to them, not as a sad ghost, but as a living part of the land. She paused, and her gaze went out to the horizon. It is also a place to say goodbye when it is time. You come here, and you look at the world one last time, and you find your peace with it. Her simple words were the most profound thing Arthur had ever heard. He understood everything now. All the separate stories, all the different places on his map, they were not separate at all. They were all connected to this one central point. This was the place where all the threads came together. This was the heart. This was where the meaning of everything was made clear. This was the final page of the book he had been reading. Lena gave him a small, kind smile. "I will leave you here for a while," she said. "Sit, rest, see." She turned and walked quietly out of the stone circle, disappearing over the edge of the summit, leaving him completely alone with the sky, the wind, and the whole world spread out at his feet. Arthur slowly sat down. He leaned his back against one of the sun-warmed stones. The stone felt solid and ancient, like it had been holding up the sky for 1,000 years. He closed his eyes for a moment, just feeling. He felt the warmth of the stone on his back. He felt the gentle touch of the wind on his face. He felt the deep, steady stillness of the rock beneath him. He took a slow, deep breath. The air was thin and pure. It filled his lungs with a clean, cold clarity. He let the breath out slowly, and with it, he let go of all the weariness, all the struggle of the climb. A profound and total peace began to settle over him, a peace so deep it felt like it was dissolving the boundaries of his own body. He opened his eyes. He did not take out a notebook. He did not think about his map. He just looked. He began to turn his head slowly, taking in the full circle of the world. He looked south towards the hidden cove of the grieving bench. From here, he could not see the bench itself, but he could see the dip in the cliffs where the cove was hidden. He saw it not as a sad place, but as a place of incredible, enduring love. He understood that the waiting woman had not been trapped by her grief. She had been empowered by her love. Her vigil was not a curse. It was a choice, a testament to a connection so strong that not even the sea could break it. He turned his gaze to the east, to the cliffs of Father's Watch. He saw the rugged edge of the land meeting the sea. He saw the two small boys, not as figures of the past, but as a permanent part of that landscape. Their hope and their love for their father were as real as the rocks themselves. He understood that Tomas came here not to mourn his father and brother, but to be with them, to feel the same sun, the same wind that they had felt, to share that small piece of eternity with them. He looked inland, to the green patchwork of the Central Valley. He saw the faint, dark line of the sunken fence. He saw Alistair, the old farmer, standing there, a lonely guardian of a lost community. But from here, high above, Arthur did not feel the sadness of the loss as sharply. He felt the richness of what had been. He saw the 5 farms. It was about a life, a full and deep and meaningful life that the valley still remembered. He looked to the hills and found the place where the Whispering Grove lay hidden. He could not see the trees, but he could feel the quiet, magical presence of the place. He felt the innocence and wonder of generations of children. He felt the comfort of secrets shared with the ancient trees. It was a place of pure, simple faith. He looked along the coast and found the bright, pale crescent of First Swim Beach. He felt the shock of the cold water. He felt the surge of courage in a child's heart. He understood that it was not a test of endurance. It was a gift. It was the island giving its children the one thing they would need to survive here: a brave heart. He sat there for hours. The shadows of the clouds drifted across the land below, changing the colors of the hills and the sea. He thought about his own life. He saw it laid out below him, just like the island. He saw the long, straight, gray line of his years in the city office. He saw the noise, the hurry, the feeling of being a small, unimportant cog in a large machine. It looked so far away now, so foreign. He felt a sense of pity for the man he had been, the man who had thought that a perfect line on a piece of paper was the most important thing in the world. He saw the path that had led him from that life to this one, the final, pointless assignment, the slow journey by train and ferry, the arrival on this island that he had thought was a banishment. He saw that it was not a banishment at all. It was a homecoming to a place he had never been, but a place that his soul had been searching for all his life. All the paths of his life, the straight ones and the crooked ones, had led him to this one point, to this simple circle of stones on top of the world. He felt the weariness in his bones, the cough in his lungs, but he did not feel sad. He felt a sense of completion. He looked out at the vast, endless sea. He looked up at the vast, endless sky. He felt his own smallness. He was a tiny speck in this immense landscape, a brief flicker of life on a very old rock. And in that feeling of smallness, he found a great and liberating peace. He was a part of this queue, was not separate from it. His life, his stories, his map, they were all just one small thread in the great, ancient tapestry of this place. The sun was beginning to sink towards the horizon, painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink. The light on the island softened, turning the greens to gold and the blues to purple. He knew it was time. He had seen what he needed to see. He had found the heart of the island, and in doing so, he had found the peace in his own. He stood up slowly, his body stiff, but his spirit light. He stood in the center of the circle one last time, and he looked out at the beautiful, sleeping island. He did not say goodbye. There was no need. He was not leaving. He was simply becoming a part of the story. Chapter 7. The Gift. The journey down from the place of seeing was a slow and gentle descent into a world that had been remade. Arthur's body was a vessel of deep, aching exhaustion. Every step on the rocky path was a careful negotiation, his legs trembling with the memory of the climb, but his spirit was light. It soared above the weariness of his flesh. He was no longer a man searching for something. He was a man carrying a precious discovery back home. He carried the heart of the island within him. He saw the world not as a collection of separate objects, but as a single, breathing whole. The rocks, the sky, the sea, the memories of the people, they were all woven together. He now understood the pattern of the weave. Lena walked beside him, her presence a quiet and steady comfort. She did not ask him what he had seen or what he had felt. She knew. The shared silence between them was full of a complete and perfect understanding. When they reached the bottom of the long path and stepped back into the village, the world felt different. The small stone cottages did not seem small anymore. They seemed dense with life, each one a container of countless stories. The narrow lanes were not just passages. They were the roots of daily joys and sorrows. Arthur looked at it all with a new kind of love, a love that was not possessive, but deeply respectful. He was a guest in this living museum, and he had just been shown its most sacred room. Lena walked with him to the door of his cottage. The sun was low in the sky, and the air was growing cool. He turned to her, the words of thanks he wanted to say feeling too small for the gift she had given him. He simply looked at her, and she understood. She placed a gentle hand on his arm for a moment. "Rest now, Arthur," she said softly. "You have earned it." Then she turned and walked away, her form disappearing into the soft twilight. Arthur entered his cottage. It felt different now. It was no longer just a temporary shelter. It was his workshop, his sanctuary, the place where the final, most important work of his life would be done. He was profoundly tired, more tired than he had ever been. He knew he should eat, that he should sleep, but a powerful, urgent energy was humming inside him. It was the energy of creation. He could not rest, not yet. The vision he had seen from the place of seeing was so clear, so vivid in his mind. He was afraid that if he slept, a part of it might fade. He had to capture it. He had to honor it. He lit the single oil lamp on his table. Its warm, yellow light pushed back the growing darkness, creating a small golden circle of purpose in the room. He looked at the large sheet of paper spread on his drawing board, his map. It was beautiful, but he saw now that it was incomplete. It was a collection of limbs without a torso, a solar system without a sun. He had work to do. He knew, with a certainty that ignored the protest of his aching body, that this work would demand everything he had left. And so began the week of creation. It was a week where time itself seemed to dissolve. The rising and setting of the sun became irrelevant. The world shrank to the size of his wooden table, to the space illuminated by the golden lamplight. His life became a simple, focused ritual of work. He barely slept. He would work until his eyes burned and his hand trembled too much to hold the pen steady. Then he would collapse into his armchair for an hour or two of thin, dreamless sleep. He would wake with a start, the image of the map burning in his mind, and he would go back to the table. He barely ate. Lena would leave small packages of food on his doorstep, a slice of cheese, a flask of soup. He would consume them without tasting them, his mind entirely consumed by the task at hand. His body protested. The cough returned, a deep, rattling sound in the quiet cottage. His joints ached, his head throbbed, but he pushed it all away. This work was more important than his body. It was his soul taking form on paper. He began by preparing his tools. He cleaned every pen tip. He filled his small glass bottles with ink, not just the black ink of his old life, but all the colors he had begun to use. He had a deep, earthy brown, the color of wet peat and ancient soil. He had a rich, dark green, the color of moss in the deepest part of the woods. He had a pale, silvery blue, the color of the sea on a calm morning. He had a fiery orange, the color of lichen on sun-warmed rocks. He had a soft, smoky gray, the color of mist in the valleys. These were his paints. This was his palette. He was not just a cartographer anymore. He was an artist. He did not begin by adding new things. He began by redrawing the very foundation of the map. With a new pot of deep brown ink, he redrew the entire coastline of the island. Before, the line had been a sharp, precise, technical boundary. Now, his pen moved with a different kind of knowledge. The line was no longer thin and perfect. It was alive. It was thicker where the cliffs were high and sheer, where the land fought a hard battle with the sea. It was softer and more delicate where the sandy beaches met the gentle waves. He drew every cove, every inlet, every rocky outcrop, not just from his notes, but from the memory of how it felt to stand there. The line he drew was not just a line. It was a story of rock and water, a story of resistance and surrender. This single act took him 2 full days. When he was done, the island on his paper was no longer a flat shape. It had weight. It had presence. It felt like it was breathing. Then he began to place the memories. He took out his collection of small notebooks. They were filled with his sketches and his hurried, heartfelt notes. He opened the first one. He read his own words describing the grieving bench. He remembered the quiet peace of the hidden cove, the gentle lapping of the waves, the immense sadness and even more immense love of the story Lena had told him. He chose his ink, a deep dark blue, the color of the sea at dusk. He drew the small symbol for the bench, a simple rectangle of stone, but he drew it with a hand that understood its weight. Next to it, he wrote the name again, but this time he added a small, almost invisible detail, a single, tiny teardrop shape drawn in a paler shade of blue, falling into the sea. Only someone looking very closely would ever see it. He moved on to Father's watch. He read his notes from his visit with Tomas, the old fisherman. He heard the gravelly voice telling the story of the two small boys, their eyes scanning the horizon for a single beloved sail. For this, he chose a different blue, a bright, hopeful sky blue. He drew the cliff not as a sharp edge, but as a place of looking, a vantage point. He added the name, and next to it, he drew a tiny, simple boat with a single sail, a mere speck on the vast emptiness of the paper sea. It was a symbol of hope, a focal point for the eye. For the sunken fence, he returned to his earthy brown ink. He read his notes, remembering the quiet dignity of Alistair, the last farmer. He drew the long, wavering line of the buried wall, making it look as if it were truly sinking into the paper. He used a cross-hatching technique to suggest the texture of the moss, the cracks in the ancient stones. He wrote the name, and he drew a tiny, leafless tree beside it, a symbol of a life that was over, but whose roots still held fast in the earth. He continued like this, story by story, place by place. Each memory was a sacred ceremony. He would read his notes, close his eyes, and transport himself back to the place. He would try to feel the same feelings he had felt when he first heard the story. Then, and only then, would he pick up his pen. For the Whispering Grove, he used the deep green ink. He did not draw a solid circle of trees. He drew it as a spiral of tiny, delicate leaves, a shape that seemed to be in constant rustling motion. It was a place of magic, and he drew it with a magical hand. For First Swim Beach, he mixed his own color. He took a drop of blue and a drop of green and added a lot of water until he had a pale, translucent turquoise, the exact color of the shockingly cold water. He painted a small wash of this color into the perfect crescent of the bay. It was the only large patch of color on the map so far, and it shimmered with a cold, clear light. Day after day he worked. The map became a living document, a repository of the island's soul. But he knew it was still missing its most important parts: the paths, the memory trails, the faint winding tracks that connected all of these sacred places. He had walked them all. He knew their twists and turns. He knew how they felt under his feet. He chose a new ink for this, a very pale, almost invisible gray. He wanted the paths to be whispers on the map, not loud declarations. He began to draw them. This was the most difficult work of all. He drew them not as solid lines, but as a series of tiny, faint dots, like ancient footsteps left on the land. He started from the grieving bench and drew the path that led back to the village. He drew the track to the lighthouse. He drew the narrow lane that led to Tomas's cottage. He drew the faint trail through the high grass that he himself had discovered. This was painstaking, exhausting work. His hand began to cramp. His eyes ached from the strain of focusing on such tiny details. His cough grew worse. shaking his whole body, sometimes causing his hand to slip. When that happened, he would let out a small cry of frustration. Then he would carefully blot the ink and correct his mistake. He was in a race with his own body. He had to finish. He drew the paths for 2 days, fueled by black tea and the fierce, burning power of his purpose. The dotted lines spread across the map like a fine spider's web. They connected the places of memory to the village. They connected them to each other. The map was no longer a collection of isolated points. It was a network, a system, a living body. And then there was only one thing left to do. The final, most sacred act. He had to place the heart. He had to draw the place of seeing. He cleaned his pens one last time. He took out his pot of smoky gray ink. He took a deep, shaky breath. His hand was trembling from exhaustion. He held it with his other hand to steady it. He found the highest point on the island, the empty space he had left in the very center of the map. He remembered the feeling of standing there, on the roof of the world. He remembered the simple, perfect circle of stones. He began to draw. He drew the circle, not a perfect geometric circle drawn with a compass. He drew it freehand. It was a circle that was slightly irregular, just like the real one. It was a human circle. He did not draw the stones as solid objects. He drew them as soft, smudged shapes, as if they were made of mist or memory. He drew the small opening that faced the rising sun, and in the very center of the circle, he did not draw anything at all. He left a space of pure, untouched paper. The empty center was the most important part. It was the place of being, the place of peace. Finally, he connected the paths. He drew the faintest gray dotted lines from the circle of stones outward to all the other places of memory. From the heart, the arteries flowed, carrying the lifeblood of meaning to every corner of the island. He was done. He put down his pen. He leaned back in his chair, his body screaming with exhaustion. He looked at his creation. The week of frenzied work was over, and the thing that lay on his table was more than a map. It was a work of art. It was a poem. It was a prayer. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever made. The lamplight shone on the different colors of ink, the deep blues, the earthy browns, the vibrant greens. It shone on the intricate web of faint gray lines. The map seemed to shimmer, to breathe. He had poured all of his skill, all of his memory, all of his love, all of his remaining life into this single sheet of paper. He felt utterly and completely empty, and he had never been so full. He looked at his masterpiece, and for the first time in his life, he felt a true and profound pride. He had done it. He had created a map that told the truth. He did not know how long he sat there, just looking. Eventually, he was roused by a soft knock on the door. It was Lena. She came in with a bowl of steaming stew. She saw the look on his face. She saw the finished map on the table. She put the stew down and walked over to the table. She stood beside him, looking down at his work. She did not speak for a very long time. Arthur watched her face. He saw her eyes move across the paper, recognizing the places. He saw a flicker of recognition as she noticed the tiny teardrop by the grieving bench. He saw the soft smile when she saw the spiral of leaves that was the whispering grove. He saw a single tear form in the corner of her eye and trace a slow path down her weathered cheek. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw it. You saw it all. It is their map, Lena," he said, his voice weak. "It belongs to the island, not to me, and not to my old company." She nodded, wiping her eye with the back of her hand. "I know," she said. "We must show them. Everyone must see this." The idea was born in that moment. in the shared understanding between the two friends. This map was not a private treasure. It was a public trust. "Tonight," Lena said, her voice full of a new energy, "we will take it to the community hall. We will show everyone. I will go and tell them." Lena left, a sense of purpose radiating from her. Arthur was left alone with his map and his bowl of stew. He ate slowly, the warm food bringing a little strength back to his weary body. As evening approached, Lena returned. The whole village was buzzing with a quiet anticipation, she told him. They were all gathering at the hall. It was time. Together, they prepared the map for its journey. They let the ink dry completely by the warm fire. Then, with the utmost care, they gently rolled it up. Arthur's hands trembled, and Lena's were steady. He felt a pang of sadness at hiding its beauty, but he knew it was necessary. The unveiling had to be a surprise. He put on his coat and took up his walking stick. He was weak. He had to lean on the table for support as he stood. Lena carried the precious roll of paper. They walked together through the village in the gathering dusk. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and the sea. Lights glowed from the windows of the community hall, a warm, welcoming beacon. As they approached, Arthur could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. His heart began to beat a little faster. He was nervous. He was about to show his soul to these people. They entered the hall. The room was full. It seemed the entire population of the island was there. He saw Tomas, the fisherman, and Alistair, the farmer, and Morag from First Swim Beach. He saw the fishermen he had come to know, their faces weathered and kind. He saw the mothers and the fathers, and he saw the children, their eyes wide with curiosity. A hush fell over the room as he and Lena entered. All eyes turned to them, to him, and to the mysterious roll of paper Lena carried. The hall was a simple, large room with a polished wooden floor. At one end, there was a small stage. At the other end, there was a long, empty wall. Lena walked to that wall. Arthur followed her, his steps slow and deliberate, his walking stick thumping softly on the wooden floor. He took 2 pins from his pocket. He and Lena stood on either side of the rolled map. They each took a corner, and together they unrolled it and pinned it to the wall. For a long moment, there was a profound and total silence in the room. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the oil lamps that lit the hall. The villagers just stared. They were looking at their home, their island, their whole world, in a way they had never seen it before. The map glowed on the wall, a universe of color and memory. Then the silence was broken. It was broken by a single, soft gasp. A young woman pointed. "Look," she whispered to her companion. "That's the grove, the Whispering Grove. It looks just like it feels." Then another voice, an old man's, "That's it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He was pointing at Father's watch. "That's the cliff." It was Tomas. He walked slowly towards the map, his eyes fixed on the tiny boat on the paper sea. He reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the paper. And then the room came alive. A low murmur grew into a buzz of conversation. People left their chairs and crowded around the map. It was a beautiful, gentle chaos. They were not just looking, they were remembering. Alistair stood before the map for a long time, his eyes on the wavering line of the sunken fence. Morag was smiling, tracing the turquoise water of First Swim Beach with her finger. She was telling a group of young children the story of her own first swim. A fisherman was pointing to a rocky part of the coast. "That's where my father's lobster pots always got snagged," he said, laughing. He called it the Devil's Claw. His son looked at the map, his eyes wide. He had a name for the place now, a story. The map had become a catalyst. It was a mirror in which the islanders could see their own shared soul. They were telling its stories back to it. The older generation was passing on the memories to the younger. The children were learning the secret, sacred geography of their home. They were seeing that the land was not just land, it was a living history book. Arthur stood back, leaning against a wall for support, his heart overflowing. This was it. This was the meaning. The map was no longer his. It had been given back to the people it belonged to. It was breathing with their voices, their laughter, their tears. After a long time, Lena gently quieted the crowd. She helped Arthur to the front of the room. He stood before them, his body weak, but his spirit strong. He looked out at their faces, at the faces of the people who had given him their stories, who had trusted him. He did not have the breath for a long speech. He did not need one. "This is your island," he said, his voice soft but clear, carrying through the quiet hall. He gestured with a shaky hand towards the beautiful map on the wall. "This is your story. It belongs to you." He paused, taking a breath. "Thank you for sharing it with me." He could say no more. He was overcome. He simply stood there, a small, weary man who had given the greatest gift he could imagine. The islanders did not clap. Applause would have felt wrong. Instead, a deep, resonant sound filled the room. It was a sound of murmuring approval, of deep gratitude. It was the sound of a community seeing itself and honoring the man who had held up the mirror. One by one, people came up to him. They did not say much. A fisherman gripped his shoulder. An old woman pressed his hand between both of hers. A small child shyly handed him a smooth, white pebble from the beach. Each touch, each look, was a thank you more profound than any words. He had done it. His final work was complete. His legacy was not an entry in a corporate database. It was this living, breathing map hanging on the wall of a community hall on a remote island. It would hang here forever, telling its stories long after he was gone. He had given the island the gift of its own memory, and in doing so, he had found the purpose of his own Chapter 8, the last path. The night in the community hall was the summit of Arthur's life. After that, a great and gentle peace settled over him. The urgency that had driven him, the race against his own failing body, was gone. His great work was finished. The map was safe. It hung on the wall of the hall, a constant, quiet presence in the heart of the village. It had become a new kind of landmark, a destination. People would wander in during the day just to look at it. They would stand before it in small, quiet groups, tracing the lines with their fingers, telling the stories to each other. It was a living thing, and it was doing its work. Arthur had given the island its memory, and now he could rest. The turning of the seasons became more noticeable. The long, bright days of the island summer began to shorten. The evenings grew cooler, the mornings mistier. The vibrant green of the landscape softened into the golden browns and muted purples of autumn. The wind carried a new chill. For Arthur, the turning of the seasons was happening inside his own body as well. The summer of his fierce creative energy had passed. He had entered the autumn of his life, a time of quiet reflection and slow letting go. He no longer took long, ambitious walks. His body would not allow it. His days now had a simpler, gentler rhythm. He would wake late after the sun was already up. He would sit in his armchair by the window for a long time, drinking his tea, watching the clouds move across the sky. His small cottage was a place of deep comfort to him now. It was no longer a cold, temporary shelter. It was his home. The islanders had made sure of that. There was always a small offering on his doorstep, a few fresh eggs from someone's hens, a jar of homemade jam, a freshly caught fish, cleaned and ready for the pan. They were small gifts, but they were gestures of a profound gratitude and a deep, quiet affection. They were looking after him. He was one of them now. In the afternoons, if he felt strong enough, he would take a short walk. He did not go far. Sometimes he would just walk to the end of the village track and back. Other times, he would make his way slowly down to the harbor. He would sit on a bench and watch the fishing boats coming and going. The fishermen would always call out a greeting to him. "Hello, Arthur. A fine day, Arthur." He would raise a hand in a weak but cheerful wave. He was a fixture now, a quiet, respected elder. The island's children, who had once been shy of the strange man with the measuring tools, now treated him as a kind of grandfather. They would run up to him, their faces bright with excitement, to show him a strange shell they had found, or a feather from a rare bird. He would smile and admire their treasures, his voice soft and kind. He was known to them as Uncle Arthur, the Mapmaker. He loved the simple, beautiful name. His cough was a constant companion. His breathing was often shallow and difficult. He was much thinner. His clothes, which had once fit him snugly, now hung loose on his body. He knew he was fading. He could feel himself growing more transparent, more ethereal with each passing day. But he was not afraid. The fear of death had left him upon that high, windy peak at the place of seeing. He had found a sense of peace so profound that it was unshakable. He had lived a good life. He had found his purpose. He had created something beautiful that would last. What was there to be afraid of? Lena was his most constant visitor. She would come every day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening. She would bring him food. She would make sure his fire was lit and his cottage was warm. She would sit with him and they would talk. Or often, they would just sit in a comfortable silence, listening to the ticking of the clock and the sound of the wind. She was his friend, his guardian, his quiet companion on this final part of his journey. She never treated him like he was sick. She never spoke of his weakness. She simply treated him as Arthur. She would tell him the small news of the village, who had a new baby, whose boat had the biggest catch, whose roof was leaking. She kept him connected to the life of the island, even as his own life was slowly withdrawing from it. One evening they were sitting by the fire. The flames cast a warm, dancing light on their faces. Arthur had a long, difficult bout of coughing. It left him weak and breathless, slumped in his chair. Lena waited patiently until it passed. When he had caught his breath, he looked at her, his eyes clear and calm in the firelight. "It will not be long now, Lena," he said. His voice was a soft, raspy whisper. He was not saying it to be sad. He was stating a simple, observable fact, like noticing the turning of the tide. Lena looked at him, her own eyes full of a deep, sad love. She did not contradict him. She did not offer false hope. She simply reached out and took his thin, frail hand in her strong, warm one. "I know, Arthur," she said. "We will miss you." "I am not going anywhere," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "I will be in the map. I will be in the wind on the hills. I will be a part of the story." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands, watching the flames die down into glowing embers. It was a perfect moment of farewell, a moment of complete and quiet acceptance. A few weeks later, the first real storm of winter arrived. The sky turned a dark, bruised gray. The wind howled around the cottage, a wild, mournful sound. The sea roared, and great waves crashed against the cliffs, sending spray high into the air. The islanders secured their boats, latched their shutters, and settled in to wait out the storm. Lena stayed with Arthur. She knew he should not be alone. They sat by the fire, listening to the fury of the world outside. The storm seemed to shake the very foundations of the small stone cottage, but inside it was warm and safe. Arthur was very weak now. He slept for most of the day in his armchair, his breathing shallow. Lena watched over him, her knitting needles moving with a slow, steady rhythm. The storm lasted for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, the world was reborn. The wind had dropped. The sky was washed clean, a pale, brilliant blue. The sun shone with a crisp, clear light that made every surface sparkle. The air was cold and pure. Arthur woke up. He felt a strange and wonderful clarity. The weariness that had been his constant companion for so long had lifted. The pain in his chest was gone. His breathing was easy and deep. He felt light. He felt new. He looked at Lena, who was dozing in the chair opposite him. He smiled. He felt a deep surge of love and gratitude for this kind, strong woman who had been his guide and his friend. He stood up from his chair. He did not feel weak. He did not need his walking stick. He felt a quiet, steady strength in his limbs. He knew with an absolute certainty that came from a place beyond thought that this was the day. This was the day for his last walk. Lena woke up as he moved about the small cottage. She looked at him, and her eyes went wide with a kind of wonder. She saw the change in him. She saw the new light in his eyes, the strange, peaceful strength in his posture. She did not need to ask. She knew. "I am going for a walk, Lena," he said. His voice was not a raspy whisper anymore. It was clear and calm. "Just a short one, by myself." She stood up. Her heart was full of a deep, wrenching sadness, but also a kind of holy joy. She understood. This was his final gift to himself, a last, peaceful journey. She went to him and put her hands on his shoulders. She looked into his clear, peaceful eyes. "I understand," she said. They did not say goodbye. Their goodbye had already been said in 100 quiet moments, in shared cups of tea, in long, comfortable silences. This was not a goodbye. This was a completion. She helped him on with his coat. He did not really need it. He did not feel the cold, but it was a part of the ritual of walking. He picked up his old, smooth walking stick. It felt light in his hand, a familiar companion. He opened the cottage door and stepped out into the bright, clean morning. The world smelled new, washed clean by the storm. He turned and gave Lena one last, beautiful, radiant smile. Then he turned and began to walk. Lena watched him go. She watched him walk up the track, his steps slow but steady. He did not look back. She watched until he was a small, dark figure against the bright green of the hills. Then she went back inside the quiet cottage and sat down, and she began to cry. They were tears of deep sorrow, but also tears of deep and profound gratitude for having known such a man. Arthur walked. He did not feel the strain in his legs or the tightness in his lungs. He felt only a wonderful sense of lightness, as if his feet were barely touching the ground. He breathed in the cold, pure air. It filled him with a clean, bright energy. He followed a path he knew by heart now, a path his own feet had helped to wear into the earth. It was the memory trail that led up into the hills. As he walked, his mind was clear and calm. He was not thinking about the past or the future. He was completely present in the now. He noticed everything with a perfect, crystalline clarity. He saw the way the sunlight caught the dewdrops on a blade of grass, turning it into a string of tiny jewels. He saw the intricate, perfect pattern of a spider's web strung between 2 stalks of heather. He heard the song of a small bird, a clear, fluting melody in the quiet air. The world was unspeakably beautiful. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace. He was not climbing to a destination. The walk itself was the destination. Every step was a memory. Every step was a prayer. He remembered the stories he had been told on these paths. He felt the presence of the waiting woman, the two small boys, the old farmer. They were not ghosts. They were a part of the landscape, a part of the air he was breathing. He was walking through his own map. He was walking through his own soul. After a long time, he reached the final steep ascent, the path that led to the place of seeing. He did not feel the struggle of the climb this time. He moved over the rocks with a strange, effortless grace. He felt as if the wind itself was helping him, lifting him up. He reached the summit. The world opened up around him, a perfect circle of land and sea and sky. The view was clearer than he had ever seen it before. He could see for miles and miles. The air was so still that he could hear the sound of the waves on the distant shore, a soft, rhythmic sigh. He walked into the center of the ancient stone circle. He stood there for a long moment, his face turned up to the vast blue sky. He felt the gentle warmth of the sun on his face. He felt a sense of belonging so complete that it dissolved the last thin boundary between himself and the world. He was no longer Arthur Pendleton, a man standing on a hill. He was a part of the hill. He was a part of the sky. He was a part of the light. He turned slowly and looked out at the island, his home. He saw it all laid out before him, a beautiful tapestry of life and memory. He saw his map, not the one made of paper and ink, but the real one, the one written on the land itself. He had done good work here. He was at peace. He walked to the edge of the circle and sat down, leaning his back against one of the great, weathered stones. The stone was solid and warm, like the hand of an old friend. He looked out at the endless, shimmering sea. He watched a single white bird soar on an invisible current of air. He closed his eyes. The last sounds he heard were the soft sigh of the distant sea and the gentle whisper of the wind moving over the ancient stones. He took one last, easy breath, and then he let it go. And in the great, peaceful silence of the high place,